Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I must have been about 15 years old when my grandfather told me and my two brothers his remarkable story. The only person who knew my grandfather's story very well was, of course, my grandmother, for she had been with him when it had happened, a young 18-year-old woman at the time. I remember her exact words when she told me what she'd seen that day. "It was like something out of a movie," she told us. "It was like me and your grandfather were watching it play out in real time. It was so surreal, wasn't it, William? Those are times I will not forget in a hurry, let me tell you. Sometimes I have to pinch myself and say, did that really happen? But happen, I assure you it did. At the time, me and my two brothers went to stay with both of my grandparents on my father's side of the family, who were living in a leafy green neighbourhood in Toronto. Me and my brothers fully appreciated our twice-yearly visits to Canada, and most especially the pleasure of reuniting with our grandparents, who were eager to take us around Canada on some exciting excursions, for they never seemed to get enough of the great outdoors. Me and my brothers were living in Nevada at the time with our parents. I was the second oldest of the three of us boys, much more reticent than my other two brothers, who were much more outgoing than I actually was. I'd always been the big thinker in our family, who enjoyed listening rather than talking too much, and my subdued, seemingly aloof manner was often mistaken for shyness, but on the contrary, I wasn't shy at all. I just tended to keep my thoughts privately to myself, for I'd never been a big talker, but shy, no, I definitely was not. We were staying with our grandparents for about 3 weeks. My parents had both flown over to Sweden to stay with my mother's parents. My mother is Swedish by nationality, and she hadn't reconnected with her parents and two siblings for a long time. Me and my brothers didn't even know our Swedish grandparents, nor did we know our aunt and uncle on my mother's side of the family. My grandmother was a small woman in size and stature. I remember she was no more than about 4 foot, but despite her petite stature, the woman had a lion heart on her. But when she drove around in her mini coupe, she'd prop herself up on several pillows so she could see the road clearly ahead of her, which I always found rather amusing. My grandfather, on the other hand, was a very big man. Strapping he was, easily over 6 foot tall. So seeing them both together was always quite funny, for many people called them little and large. But you could see, despite the vast height differences between the two of them, they were unequivocally meant to be together, like pepper belonging with salt and bread belonging with butter. Some things, I guess, are just meant to be, almost as if they were preordained before our earthly existence ever came into being. For me personally, I've never believed in coincidences. I certainly believe, from all my research I've done over the course of my very short life, is that things were mapped out before we were born. My grandparents first met through their mutual love of bird watching. Both are and were obsessed with birds, with an impassioned enthusiasm that I have yet to see in anyone else. Indeed, in my grandparents' house, Everything is absolutely devoted to birds, from the pictures on the walls to the placemats on the tables, and every time you have your cup of tea or coffee in the morning, it is guaranteed that you'll be drinking out of a mug with a picture of a bird on it. My grandmother claimed that her love of birds occurred when she was only 13 years old. It had been a routine morning at her home in Toronto, where she'd grown up as a single child, when she'd gone out to hang the washing on the line for her mother. My grandmother said it had been a beautiful day. The washing smelt strongly of lavender, and as it was summer she knew the washing would thankfully dry very quickly. When my grandmother began to peg out the washing on the line, something green flew towards her. My grandmother's first reaction was, "What is that?" Then she saw it, the most beautiful bird she'd ever seen. She knew instinctively it was a parrot, and guessed it had to be someone's pet bird that had managed to escape its cage. It was green with red in the plumage. It had flown onto the washing line very assuredly, and perched there all the while watching my grandmother very intently. She couldn't believe how tame it was, for she could have easily reached out and quickly stroked its plumage. My grandmother started talking to the parrot. "Hello there! What's your name? Who are you? Where do you come from? You escaped your cage, didn't you? You naughty little bird. You flew away from your owner. I'm sure they must be very worried about your whereabouts." To my grandmother's surprise, the parrot kept saying, "Jack and Jill went up the hill. Ring-a-ring-a-rosy, ring-a-ring-a-rosy. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Great fall, great fall, Humpty Dumpty." My grandmother laughed because she knew the parrot had learnt to recite nursery rhymes. Once my grandmother picked up the washing basket to retreat indoors. The parrot landed on her shoulders, perching there very stoically. My grandmother told the parrot to leave and to go, but it refused to move. It wouldn't leave her alone. My grandmother's own parents didn't want her to keep the bird, and did their very best to find the original owner. It turned out that 2 days before the owner died, who I believe was an elderly lady in her 90s, the bird had simply flown away. It was almost as if the parrot instinctively knew that its owner's days were up, and went in search of a new home, deciding after meeting my grandmother that she'd do very nicely as his new guardian, thank you very much. My grandmother's parents, seeing how devoted she was to the parrot, allowed her to keep it. She very affectionately called the parrot Kiki, and adored the bird. It nibbled her ear with its beak, and impersonated anyone that visited the house, which my grandmother found hilariously funny, even if it was sometimes rather inappropriate. At the time, my grandmother's parents had an annoying next-door neighbour. She was known by everyone as the town gossip, because she loved nattering about everybody, and putting her nose into everybody's business. The woman's name was Imelda, and my grandmother would say, "Oh no, it's Imelda!" And when Imelda was invited into the house for a cup of tea, which incidentally she never refused, my grandmother's mother feigned delight in seeing the overbearing woman as she welcomed her into the home. But my grandmother's parrot was having none of it, and let it be known my grandmother's mother's real feelings about Imelda. When it kept parroting out, "Oh God, it's Imelda! No, no, no! Oh God, it's Imelda! No, no, no!" Imelda said to my grandmother's mother, "So is that how you really feel about me? I know when I'm not wanted. I can't believe you feel this way about me. And we've been friends for years. Oh, don't be like that, Imelda," my grandmother's mother would say. "Don't listen to the parrot. It doesn't know what it's talking about." But Imelda stormed out of the house and never bothered my grandmother's parents again. My grandmother's pet parrot died when she was about 50 years old. It was sad, but it was believed the parrot was already a very old bird, because those birds can live long lives, sometimes outliving their owners. As for my grandfather, his love for birds happened when he rescued a baby owl that he found hopping around under a tree on the ground, hanging on to life by a fine thread. My grandfather brought the tiny owl back to health. When the owl was strong enough, he put the owl in a bird aviary that he purchased with his own pocket money, which he placed in the yard, so that the owl could learn to fly on its own. When he was confident the owl could survive in the wild, he let it go free. At first the owl was rather reluctant to fly away, but then suddenly it was gone. My grandfather was naturally glad to have saved the owl's life, but he never believed for a single second he'd see the owl again. But how wrong he was about that. In the years that followed, the owl he rescued always came back to the family house. My grandfather would be alerted to hooting and something tapping on his window pane outside his bedroom. He'd pull back the curtains and open his bedroom window, and the owl would fly into his bedroom and perch on the bedpost, his round yellow eyes fixed on my grandfather, who would say, "Oh, it's you, Marlowe. You've come back to say hello, have you?" The owl would even perch on his hand for a short while, and my grandfather would lovingly stroke his plumage, and then the owl would retreat through the open window and fly out into the night. My grandfather was delighted that the owl kept visiting him. It was as if it was telling my grandfather it was alive and well. He believed it came to see him because it never forgot the fact that it had been rescued by him, and sometimes even our feathery friends don't forget an act of great kindness. At the time when my grandfather had found the dishevelled owl, even his own parents had looked at it sadly and said, "Let nature take its course, love. The thing's not going to make it. Anyone can see that. The owl is on its way out. Look at the thing. It's so dreadfully weak, missing most of its feathers. It's barely hanging on to life." My grandfather had refused to listen to their well-meaning advice. He didn't want to give up on the owl, and did everything in his power to feed the owl, bringing it back to full strength and health. He had looked after the owl in his bedroom, without even his parents knowing about it. He began feeding the owl pieces of raw meat with a pair of tweezers. I guess this owl never forgot my grandfather never gave up on it, like others most surely would have done. But it was my grandfather's personal relationship with this owl that birthed in him a very real passion for birds. Growing up, his bedroom walls betrayed this love, for they were covered with posters of eagles soaring up in the sky, and bookshelves stacked to the brim with books on birds. And let's not kid, my grandfather had a big passion for owls as well. One day my grandfather's mother told him about a bird-watching meeting that was going on in the town hall, where you could get together with like-minded individuals to form a group of people who could go bird-watching together. My grandfather rather liked the idea of sharing his passion for birds with others who felt the same way about our feathery friends as he so clearly did. When he arrived at the town hall, he realized that everyone he met was significantly older than him, as most people my grandfather's age would not be interested in birds. My grandfather started talking to other bird enthusiasts and realized to his astonishment that the generation gap was both insignificant and completely irrelevant if you shared a mutual love of birds together. My grandfather suddenly noticed a young, very attractive woman who looked to be about his age. She was sharing a large, colourful book of rare American birds with an older man. Together they were talking as they paged through the book together, and laughing. My grandfather was secretly glad that among this older collection of people there was someone here that was from his own generation. My grandfather had been staring at my grandmother for quite some time, I believe. She must have sensed someone was looking at her rather obtrusively, for she briefly glanced up at my grandfather and flashed him a big, bright, sunny smile, and in that quintessential moment my grandfather absolutely knew that this was the girl for him, and the rest, shall we say, is history. Needless to say, their dating was less traditional than most, for they spent a lot of their time bird-watching together, and they joined a bird-watching group that called themselves the Magpies, where they formed great friendships with people from older generations, based on a shared love and devotion to birds. I remember it was over dinner one night that my older brother Keegan asked my grandparents if they believed in ghosts. It would seem at the time Keegan was nursing a deep fascination for all things paranormal, and had grown very interested in the subject. It all started for him, I believe, when his best friend at school, called Cullen, had told him that on the day his grandfather had passed, he had come to visit him during the night to bid him farewell, as they had been very close together. He told my brother Keegan that he woke up in the middle of the night, sensing someone was definitely in the bedroom with him. He thought his mother was looking in on him during the night, as she so often did, to check that he had switched off his bedside light. He opened his eyes, wiping away his sleep, and was about to say something to his mother about wishing she wouldn't disturb him. But he did a double take when he realized it was not his mother in his bedroom, but his grandfather, who happened to live in Georgia, and was sitting at the end of his bed. "Pops," he said, "what are you doing here in Nevada? And here in our house? Mum never told us you were coming to visit us." His grandfather looked as he always did, for there was nothing ghost-like or remotely ethereal about his appearance to suggest that he wasn't physical. "Before I go, son, I've come to say goodbye. Say goodbye to your mother for me, will you? And don't forget how much I love you all." Cullen fell back into a deep sleep, not realizing for a single second that anything outer-worldly had transpired. The following morning he asked his mother the whereabouts of Pops. "Have you seen him, Mum?" "Of course I haven't seen him," she said. "He's in Georgia, not here in Nevada." "Well, he is here. I saw him last night," Cullen insisted. "He was sitting at the end of my bed. He said he'd come to say goodbye." When Cullen told his mother this, she was not remotely amused, saying that he must have had a vivid dream because no, Pops was not in the house with them. He was in Georgia. Of course, it was later confirmed, well, about an hour later to be exact, that Cullen's grandfather had died in his sleep the previous night. His mother didn't know what to make of her son's bizarre story, for he insisted it was true. My brother Keegan shared Cullen's account with my grandparents, asking them whether they believed in ghosts, and what was their take on Cullen's seemingly nonsensical story. For to my brother Keegan, it could only mean that this physical existence of ours is not all there is, and that Tesla was right when he said we go on. "Ghosts have to be real, Pops," said Keegan excitedly, his lips trembling as he talked. "I mean, how do you explain what happened to Cullen? He swears blind it's true." "Well," said my grandfather, running a hand through his white hair and thinking about Keegan's words. "So this friend of yours, how long have you known him exactly? Have you known him to make up stories for attention, perhaps?" Keegan looked distinctly put out by these rather abrupt, seemingly scathing comments from my grandfather. He didn't like the insinuation that Cullen might have made the story up. Keegan frowned and said, "I've known Cullen since I was 6 years old, Grandpa. He's never lied to me, not once. So why would he make this up? Besides anything else, Cullen has never been attention-seeking. He's a bit like Ian over there," he said, pointing to me. "He's not shy, just a thoughtful person who hates any kind of attention. He would prefer to sink into the shadows all the time. I mean, at school he never raises his hand to anyone, even though he probably knows the answers to all the questions, because he's the cleverest boy in our class. He's got straight A's all the way." "Well, Cullen could have experienced a very lucid dream, could he not?" my grandfather challenged Keegan. "It wasn't a dream, Gramps," Keegan insisted. "Cullen recalls vividly waking up, seeing his grandfather at the end of his bed. He says this was no dream. It was extremely vivid and very real." "Don't look so riled up, Keegan," my grandfather chuckled. "Look at your face. You're taking this all extremely seriously, aren't you? Try to be a little light-hearted, won't you? I'm only asking these things to establish whether the story your friend told you is true or not. But from what you're saying, it sounds authentic to me. But you have to ask those difficult questions, don't you, to ascertain whether someone is telling you the truth or not. But it does sound to me like a rather extraordinary story, and for the record, I believe the story that Cullen told you is true," said my grandfather. Maybe he was very close to his grandfather, so it was very significant for his grandfather to bid him farewell. At this, my brother looked extremely pleased. His eyes lit up. "So you believe in ghosts, do you, Grandpa? If Cullen's grandpa appeared to him, then it means after this life, well, we don't die, do we? We move on into a different dimension, which is not a physical one, but I think we still remain ourselves." "Well, if I told you I didn't believe in ghosts, son, I'd be an absolute fool," said my grandfather. "I do believe there are more things on heaven and earth than we could ever imagine. And yes, I do believe in life after death, if you must know. I've never been an atheist. I believe in a higher power, as everything on this earth has a divine order to it. And I don't believe randomly it just came into being like Darwin's theory of evolution, which makes absolutely no sense to me at all. I think there is intelligent design behind everything, so there has to be a creator. If you must know, there are things out there we don't know even exist that are very, very real. What things, Grandpa? Asked Keegan, his eyebrows raised in earnest. Go on, my grandmother suddenly interceded. William, tell the kids our story, why don't you? I think the boys would love to hear it, and it's a story well worth hearing, as unbelievable as it is. But I think our grandchildren would love it, and it's a story that deserves to be told, don't you think? Everyone involved in that story now is dead, so it's not as if we're betraying anybody's trust or going to hurt anyone. Besides, I don't think the people in question would mind the story being told. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Emma, love. I thought we said we should keep what happens strictly between ourselves. Remember all those years ago? We swore blind to each other. We wouldn't tell a living soul, and we've kept that promise. And even if the people concerned are now dead, a promise, is it not? My grandmother raised her small little hand in the air in a defiant protest. Oh, for goodness sake, William, stop being such an old stick in the mud, will you? You're not betraying someone's trust if they're dead, are you? The idea is absolutely ridiculous. That was then. I'm sorry, but it was an awfully long time ago. Things are extremely different now, are they not? Do you really want to take our story down to the grave with you? Wouldn't it at the very least be nice to share our story with our grandchildren? I'm sure they'll keep our story secret, won't you, boys? She asked us. We all nodded. Maybe one day they can share it with their own grandchildren. We can keep the story in our family, can't we? Me and my brothers nodded in earnest, our eyes stoically fixed on our grandfather with an intensity of note. Everything went serenely quiet around the dinner table. My grandmother's hearty stew, along with the large wedges of corn bread that she had made, were left on our plates untouched, for not a single utensil moved, nor was a glass of water quaked. I'm sure at this point we were clandestinely all earnestly praying within ourselves that my grandfather would share his story with us. I did feel the excitement bubbling up inside me, like a kettle being brought up to the boil, for this was a story my grandparents had intended to take down to the grave with them. That meant it really had to be a spectacular story that could easily raise brows and cause jaws to drop open. I don't know about you, but in my humble opinion, those are the kind of stories that are worth telling. And we certainly wanted to hear this story, especially if the people involved in it were all now deceased. I mean, what harm would there be in our grandfather telling it to us? I could see a reluctant doubt creeping across my grandfather's wrinkled face, weathered by time with a road map of lines that revealed he had lived a very long, interesting life. His kindly pale blue eyes seemed to be caught up in a long-lost wistful memory, permeated by the rich fragrance of a warm nostalgia. I was suddenly certain he was not going to share his story with us, and I could feel the disappointment surfing up in my veins as I held my breath rather too hard, waiting with great apprehension to hear him refusing my grandmother's request, for I knew my grandfather all too well, and he could be doggedly stubborn at the very best of times, and his no usually meant no. My grandfather shook his head. No, Emma, I don't think it's wise to share the story, even with our grandchildren. I don't think it's appropriate. We made a promise not to speak of this again, and I, for one, want to honour that. My grandmother shook her grey curly head of hair indignantly. Even though it was short, a couple of hair curls twitched and stood up on end, as if they, too, were standing up to my grandfather. If you're not going to tell the story, William, then I will, but I won't tell it as well as you do. You're very good with the details, William, always have been. Go on, love, be a sport. Tell our grandchildren the story. I want them to hear it. I knew very well that the only person in this entire world that had the ability to persuade my grandfather to do anything and to pull his strings was my grandmother. She could look at him straight in the eyes and tell him to do something for her, like picking up a bottle of milk at the grocery store, or to go and take the rubbish outside, for my grandfather would refuse her nothing. I never heard him once raise his voice to my grandmother, or grumble under his breath about something she'd asked him to do that he didn't feel like doing. My grandfather lived to please my grandmother, because he loved her so much and was eager to make her extremely happy. He lived by the age-old adage, happy wife, happy life. Very well, said my grandfather. I will tell our grandchildren the story, because if I don't tell it to you, your grandmother will tell it, and you'll miss out on the very important details that should not be overlooked. If you tell a story, you need to get into the meat of it all, so that you can chew on it in the years to come. That's how I see it anyway. My grandmother's eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. She beckoned for everyone to leave the dinner table and to relax on the couches in the living room, for this was a story that would take some telling. So without even considering our grandmother's delicious hearty food, still steaming on our plates, we all eagerly traipsed off to the living room and settled down comfortably on the settees there. I don't think any of us slouched, not for a moment. Our backs were as straight as pencils, standing up to full attention, for we were about to hang on to every word that came out of our grandfather's mouth, and these would be words we would never ever forget. My grandfather always sat on a large chair in the corner of the living room. It was upholstered in red, green, and gold to match the rest of the furnishings. My grandmother had insisted on getting the chair recovered. She said it had become an eyesore in the living room. My grandfather had picked up the chair from an old antique shop in town and fallen for it straight away. He loved it so much that he had refused to change anything about it, until my grandmother insisted some changes were necessary. My grandfather sighed as he sank comfortably into the chair, his long legs stretched out before him, while my grandmother rushed off to get him a tot of whisky, claiming a bit of Dutch courage was needed for the story to be told, because parts of it were quite unsettling. My grandfather tossed the drink gratefully to the back of his throat, where it burnt significantly, and it went down in a swig, and then he said, "Well, when I tell a story, I like to start at the very beginning, so that's exactly what I will do. I was 18 years old at the time. Me and your grandmother had become extremely close by then. We were inseparable. Even our own parents on both sides of the family knew it was only a matter of time before I popped the question. I would have done so sooner, even though we were teenagers, just approaching our 20s. But I was secretly saving up for your grandmother, to buy her the perfect ring. Me and your grandmother were very keen bird watchers, but you know that already," he said, his eyes quickly glancing over at the large picture above the mantel of two eagles in flight, hovering over a grand canyon. "Let's just say, I'm sure you would agree with me on this, that if a casual observer was to wander into our home here in Toronto, they'd take one look at the decor and know at once that whoever lived here was completely fixated on birds, and they wouldn't be wrong about that, would they?" "Definitely not," said Keegan. "Mum always knows what to get you and Granny for Christmas. She knows if it's something to do with birds, you'll both love it." "That's true enough," chuckled my grandfather. "Well, getting on with my story. Me and your grandmother made friends with about 12 other like-minded people in the bird-watching group, which was called the Magpies. We'd often go off as a team to various places around Canada, where we would go bird-watching together. The 12 of us became very good and extremely close friends, despite the generation gaps between us, because none of that mattered. We had so much in common. The bird-watching group was called the Magpies, and being part of a large bird-watching group like this with like-minded individuals, helped us to spot unusual birds together. Because one person might spot something that the rest of us failed to see. It always helps having lots of eyes pinned over a sizable area, as our feathery friends can be somewhat elusive, small in size, easily overlooked, even if you do happen to have the keenest eyesight on you and a good pair of binoculars on hand. Sometimes me and your grandmother would drop things at a moment's notice if a rare bird was spotted at a specific location. Birds like the imperial Amazon, perhaps, or a blue-eyed ground dove, or a dwarf kingfisher, and many other rare birds. We'd drop almost anything to see them. We'd rush off to our rendezvous and meet up with other members of the magpies. We would regularly visit places like Point Pelee National Park, as they have over 390 bird species there. We'd also visit the Kimwan Bird Walk in Alberta. A lovely sight for watching birds it is. It's an area surrounded by many lakes, for you'll find where there is water, there's usually a plethora of bird life. When the magpies went bird watching together, after our rendezvous, we were usually naturally tired, thirsty and hungry, so we'd go off together to enjoy a light snack. We loved hanging out in each other's company, talking about the day's activities and the birds we'd spotted. The enthusiasm was always boundlessly infectious. One day when me and your grandmother were bird watching, at a sanctuary in one of those bird hides, so to speak, overlooking a spectacularly beautiful silvery lake, we were all sitting down rather patiently and waiting to see some interesting bird life. I overheard one of the bird watchers that was sitting next to me on one of the benches talking to a friend of his called Paul Mitchin, who would regularly come bird watching with us because he was part of the magpie group. Paul Mitchin would tirelessly complain about his wife all the time. Looking back, I think he was letting off steam. Sharing his marital issues with us made his life more bearable, I suspect. Everyone was naturally sympathetic towards his plight, believing he was being unfairly treated by his wife Esmeralda, while others privately probably thought that there was no pleasing the likes of Paul Mitchin, and that even if he was married to the perfect goddess, he'd probably have found fault with them. He called his wife the old duck. I suppose when you live in a world devoted to birds, and birds are all that you talk about for the vast majority of time, it wasn't actually that surprising he called his wife a duck. But I gather he never dared call her the old duck to her face, for the woman would likely have thrown him to the curb, as by the sounds of things Esmeralda ruled the Mitchin household with an indomitable cast-iron grip. So yes, Mr. Mitchin was pretty miserable, wasn't he, love? Said my grandfather, turning to my grandmother to affirm this point. Absolutely, said my grandmother, happily interjecting herself into the conversation. If you must know, I've never met anyone like Paul Mitchin before, because like your grandfather has pointed out, when we met him, he never stopped complaining about his wife. At first I thought he was a misogynist who didn't have much time for women, but later I realized how wrong I was about that. I felt significantly guilty for having assumed the very worst about his character and completely misjudging him. There was no doubt the poor man was in a loveless marriage. That was very certain. He was constantly being bullied and ridiculed by his very condescending wife, who was always belittling him and finding fault with him, telling him not to leave his wet towel on the floor, to take his shoes off when walking on the carpet, to make absolutely sure he washed his hands before eating and brushed his teeth before going to bed, to leave the toilet seat down at all times, all that kind of stuff, which was incredibly demeaning for the poor man. People instinctively know what they need to do. They don't need someone telling them. I can imagine the way Esmeralda treated Paul Mitchin. Must have made him feel like he'd become a boy all over again. She'd tell her husband how to live his life, as if she was the Mother Superior at a Catholic private school, always running her mouth about what you could or could not do. And no man wants to feel completely emasculated like that. My grandmother paused for a moment, and then said, Well, I do remember Paul Mitchin telling us magpies that his pedantic, overbearing wife Esmeralda didn't understand why he spent so much time with us bird-watching. She failed, of course, to appreciate his true love for birds. She ridiculed him incessantly about his passion, almost as if his interest in birds was juvenile, stupid, and not manly enough. The woman was insufferable, he told us. She's always on at me about this and about that. She treats me like I'm a child. Sometimes when Esmeralda is very mad at me, if she's ranting over something because I've said something that's clearly offended her, I'll discover she's locked me up in the bedroom or the study and won't let me out for several hours until I've apologized to her for whatever it is that I've clearly done. Sometimes I don't even know what to apologize for, as I don't know what made her mad in the first place, as everything I do seems to rattle her cage these days and rub her up the wrong way. Sometimes it is the most trivial, unlikely things that will set my wife off. Like if I come home from the store, for example, with the wrong brand of tuna fish. She'll then throw a tantrum and rant about it, tossing out all the tuna furiously that I purchased in the dumpster, claiming it's so substandard that even our cat wouldn't dream of eating it. I think some people in the Magpies believed that Paul Mitchen's wife's objectionable treatment of him was highly exaggerated, almost as if Paul himself was looking for sympathy from us. Many in the group thought this way, until Paul Mitchen's friend, Mr. Robin Cartwright, who was a member of the Magpies, was invited to dinner at the Mitchens' house. Robin Cartwright got the shock of his life, let me tell you, when he joined the Mitchens one night for dinner. Let's just say he was utterly appalled at the disrespectful way Paul's wife Esmeralda treated him. Robin told us Magpies in extreme confidence that he had a new sense of respect for Paul Mitchen, for he had never seen a man put up with so much abuse at the hands of his own wife, the woman who's supposed to love him and have his back. Robin went on to tell us that Esmeralda had about as much charm as a duck-billed platypus, and was so demasculating and verbally condescending towards Paul. It was over dinner that Mr. Cartwright witnessed Esmeralda's treatment of Paul first-hand, almost as if he was a fly on the wall, observing everything. And let's just say he might as well have been, for there was no interaction between Paul and his wife. He claimed the energy around the dinner table that evening was tight and tense, like a starched napkin. Esmeralda told Paul she was delighted he'd joined them for dinner, and it was a pleasure to finally meet him. But the three of them ate their dinner in absolute silence. There was no conversation whatsoever. It was like you were eating a school dinner, with the head teacher observing your manners. And Esmeralda's beady dark eyes were fixed on Paul for the entire meal. Robin said he'd never felt so uncomfortable, seated around a dinner table, as all you could hear was the clatter of cutlery and the tinkle of glasses, and beyond that, everything was completely mute. Finally, the cat walked into the room and began to meow incessantly. Robin said that helped relieve some of the stress around the table, as Esmeralda excused herself and got up to attend to the cat's rather demanding needs, returning to the table, apologizing profusely for the rude interruption on the cat's part. At one point, Esmeralda leant over the table to wipe Paul's moustache, claiming he had breadcrumbs on his moustache, which Robin said was not remotely true. It was like she was looking for any opportunity to scold her husband, as if in some really bizarre way it brought her a great deal of satisfaction, bringing him to heel, rather like a badly behaved dog. "Look at yourself, love. Oh, you're such an embarrassment, aren't you?" she said. "We've got a guest, so you should mind your manners, Paul. If only you learned to eat a little bit more respectfully. I'm sure Mr. Cartwright over here doesn't want to see everything going on in your mouth, do you, Mr. Cartwright?" she said, her steely eyes fixed on poor Robin. "You mustn't mind my husband's appalling manners, Mr. Cartwright. I'm sorry that you have to witness them first-hand. I'm afraid Paul never seems to learn how to eat with his mouth fully closed. Believe me, I've tried to teach him to mind his manners, but he never appears to be able to learn." Robin Cartwright was determined to stick up for Paul. He turned around to Esmeralda and abruptly said,
I think Paul has meticulous manners, and I didn't notice any crumbs on his moustache either." Esmeralda Mitchin just laughed. "You're very generous to say that, Mr. Cartwright, very generous indeed. Of course you would say that about your good friend, because you're an incredibly kind man, and I do appreciate your generosity, really I do. For the record, you have no idea what I have to put up with this husband of mine. He can be so dreadfully sloppy at the very best of times, and he has absolutely no clue how to dress. And I can see, Mr. Cartwright, based on what you are wearing tonight, that you are a very well put-together man. When it comes to my Paul, I'm afraid, I always have to instruct him on what to wear. If he had his way, he'd leave our house looking more than a little dishevelled, let me tell you. His tie would probably be put on incorrectly. His shoes would be scuffed, so I have to give them a jolly good old polish. I always tell him the importance of presenting himself well to the world, but I'm afraid with Paul it falls on deaf ears. He has no real interest in impressing people, you see, Mr. Cartwright. He'd happily wear the same old clothes day after day if given the chance, without even bothering to change them, and I'm not joking either. Good job he's got me to nip him into shape, or God knows what he'd look like. I buy all Paul's clothes myself. The man just wouldn't know how to put anything together. So if you appreciate how well dressed my husband is, well, I have to tell you, Mr. Cartwright, it's all down to me. Not that I wish to gloat, of course. Well, I've never known Paul to be anything less than well presented, Robin said. But even if he were to wear the same casual clothes every day, would it really be such a train smash? I don't think so. At this, Esmeralda burst out laughing. She waved a finger at Robin and said, "You're a naughty man, Mr. Cartwright. I like you, very much as it happens. You've got a very good sense of humour, and I appreciate that." "But I wasn't joking, Mrs. Mitchin," Robin said. "Oh, call me Esmeralda, Mr. Cartwright," said Esmeralda, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She didn't think for a single second that Robin was being remotely serious. In a moment of privacy, when Mrs. Mitchin excused herself from the table and scurried away to get the dessert ready, which was, I believe, a pavlova covered with fresh fruit and plenty of whipped cream, Robin Cartwright turned around to Paul and said, "My God, your wife is something else, isn't she? I don't mean that as a compliment, Paul. Why the hell don't you just get a divorce and be done with it? Then you won't have to put up with her hen-pecking and nagging all the time. Esmeralda can't see any good in you, can she? She talks about you as if you're an insubordinate child that has misbehaved badly in school and is about to be issued with a detention. I'm telling you, Paul, you deserve a whole lot better than to be treated with such disdain and disrespect. By your own wife, for goodness sake. I've never seen anything so despicable before. And the worst part of it all, Esmeralda doesn't even realize what she's doing to you, how badly she's treating you. I must apologize to you, Paul, in person. I never realized for a second things were this bad for you. Some people in the Magpies thought you were exaggerating about the state of your marriage, looking for sympathy and attention when you aired your grievances to us. But on the contrary, you minimized how bad things really were between the two of you. If the truth be told, Paul, I've never met a woman as obnoxious as your wife, and I don't say that lightly. She's a very unkind, ruthless woman. You're a saint to put up with the likes of her." Paul responded with a heavy heart, and said very matter-of-factly to Robin, "You think what you witnessed around the dinner table tonight is bad, do you? You haven't seen the half of it. You have no idea what that woman is really like, but I will spare you those details. I grumble about her incessantly to the Magpies, to vent and let off a little steam. I don't tell everyone just how bad she can get, for fear, probably, that they wouldn't believe me. Esmeralda is on her best behaviour tonight, as you are our guest, but I won't tell you what goes on behind closed doors. unless I want to humiliate myself for admitting I put up with all this. I'm ashamed of myself for being so pathetically subservient towards her. I think I'm more like a mouse than a man these days, for I seem unable to stand up to her. But believe me, I've tried over the years. But it's no good. She seems to always end up getting the last laugh. I feel intimidated by my own wife, and every evening after work I dread returning home to her. My boss at the office, Mr. Ramsay, thinks I'm such a diligent hard worker, because I'm the first to arrive and the last to leave the offices on a working day. He falsely believes I'm devoted to my job, and is always giving me promotions as a consequence because of my devotion to my work. But he doesn't know that it's not an unbridled ambition that is driving me to work every day, to work these insane hours of mine. It's simply because I can be away from Esmeralda for as long as I possibly can. Was she always like this, Paul? If you don't mind my asking. Robin Cartwright asked Mr. Mitchin outright. You see, Robin was privately wondering how such a decent, lovely man like Paul Mitchin had ended up marrying the snake in the Garden of Eden, so to speak. I mean, how did you meet her? He asked rather lamely. Paul Mitchin dabbed a napkin over his moustache to wipe away some invisible breadcrumbs, and then he said, Well, let's see, shall we? Where did I meet Esmeralda? That's a very good question. I was about 29 years old at the time, unmarried, so ostensibly my mother was getting ants in her pants about my unmarried status. I had not met a girl to settle down with, and in my mother's opinion, that was the end of the world. I think she thought I would remain a bachelor for the rest of my life, and she didn't want that for me. I think a large part of her desire for me to get married was self-serving, of course, because she wanted to have grandchildren. But alas for my mother, her dreams to become a grandmother were never realized. I made certain of that. I never wanted to make Esmeralda pregnant. Can you imagine the two of us having children? Those poor kids. I wouldn't want them to have to put up with the likes of Esmeralda as a mother. I know exactly what you mean, Paul, Robin admitted. I think your wife would be a tyrant for a mother. Anyway, continued Paul, my mother told me if I didn't commit to someone soon by the time I wanted to settle down and have a family, there'd be no good woman left. My mother could be alarmist like that. I didn't care that I hadn't met anyone. It wasn't actually a big deal for me at the time. I enjoyed being single to a certain extent, but I never told my mother this, of course. My mother was expressing her extreme disappointment to friends about my unmarried status. She was asking around if anyone knew of a nice girl who might be a suitable companion for me, that I could eventually marry one day. My mother was asking everyone who would listen, as if I was a hopeless cause. She didn't even discriminate who she asked. That's how desperate she was for me to get married and to find a wife. She asked the postman, the butcher, the baker, the grocer, you name it, if they knew of anyone who would have me, as if she was advertising for a stray dog that was looking for a loving home, someone who would be willing to adopt it. It was very embarrassing, to say the very least, but my mother's pursuit for a romantic partner for me was relentless in every sense of the word. By all accounts, I'm afraid to say, my mother has always been the kind of woman that is very driven. She gets exactly what she wants. When she decides to go for something, she does so with all guns blazing, let me tell you. The manager's wife of our grocery store in town said she knew of this lovely, incredibly pretty, demure, young 28-year-old lady who was unmarried. Her name was Esmeralda, and she suggested that she set us up on a blind date. My mother was overjoyed. She planned the whole thing and had very high expectations. As you can imagine, she told me not to blow things between me and Esmeralda. She wanted me to be the perfect gentleman towards this woman, and to make sure I showed her a very good time. So I took Esmeralda out on our very first date. I remember my mother saying to me very sternly, "Don't let her slip through your hands, love. Please don't. This one's a keeper, let me tell you. And if you let her go, I promise you, you will live to regret it. Believe me, I know. Women like her, well, they don't grow on trees. When I saw Esmeralda for the very first time, I was struck by how beautiful she was. In truth, I don't think I'd ever seen a more beautiful woman in my life. So my heart was wildly aflutter, dangerously so, you could say. I looked upon her adoringly, not really getting to know her first, which on my part was a catastrophic, very foolish mistake. I guess I thought her personality would match her outside veneer, like a woman's shoes match her handbag. Even my male friends were encouraging me to tie the knot with her. They believed I'd struck gold, and for a short while I thought I had done so too, until I realized the gold I'd pulled in was fool's gold, and not the real thing. I had not got to know Esmeralda at the time, because she seemed quiet, shy, and somewhat self-effacing, rather like a rosebud that has not yet opened, so you aren't aware of its full glory. I thought she was very sweet. My mother, of course, persuaded me to propose to Esmeralda on our second date. She was terrified that the relationship between the two of us would go up in plumes of smoke. Let's just say it would certainly have done so if I'd got to know her a little better. I didn't realize at that point in time that there was an insidiously dark side to my wife, that she kept well hidden from the world, and the cat only came out of the bag, I'm afraid, after I got married to her, and then I found out that she really could scratch. Robin Cartwright raised a brow. Don't tell me you listened to your mother, Paul. Surely you realized rushing into marriage was a very bad idea. Surely you weren't that naive. I mean, you didn't even know Esmeralda at the time. If she really was such a catch, why had she not been snapped up a long time ago by a handsome man? Granted, she may have been beautiful, but everybody knows beauty is not enough to sustain a marriage long term. There has to be a deeper connection between two people when they make a commitment to each other, so that they can weather the storms of life together. If the person has a personality you cannot abide, even the beauty you first thought you appreciated will slip away and dissolve, almost as if it never existed. I've seen that happen before. Paul shrugged his shoulders with a resigned acceptance of defeat, like someone admitting they've already lost the war. I know. You don't have to tell me something I already know. I was a complete idiot, wasn't I? The only thing I can say in my defence is I had no real experience with women. I'd been to an all-boys school, you see, my entire life. I never had any girlfriends, or any experience with the fairer sex. When it came to dating in the early days, I was a blubbering idiot, and the woman I dated never accepted a second date with me, and I can hardly blame them for that. When Esmeralda came along, I guess I really found her beauty so alluring. So I decided to take my mother's seasoned advice. I popped the question to her, but never for a single second did I believe she'd actually say yes. But I guess I thought I had nothing to lose. I genuinely thought I'd fallen head over heels in love with her. I found her so pleasing on the eye. But as you say, that is not enough. And that certainly came back to haunt me in a brutal way, you could say. Don't tell me after 2 weeks of dating Esmeralda, she accepted your proposal, asked Robin, looking quite taken aback by this. It sounds like she was very eager to get married. Rather too eager, if you ask me. And that's a red flag. I knew my wife, I'll have you know, for 2 years before I married her. Not that I'm trying to make you feel bad about that. Of course, I've heard of people much like yourself who got married after one meeting, and years later they're still happy. So I guess you can say when it comes to us men, one cap does not fit us all. And I guess those men who married someone in haste and ended up extremely happy were the lucky ones who played a game of Russian roulette with their lives and ended up winning the lottery. Well, I was an idiot, wasn't I? Poor Mitchin admitted. A big idiot. I should have stood up to my mother's pressure. Even my father told me as much. He told me very firmly not to marry Esmeralda. He did? Asked Paul Cartwright, his eyes widening in surprise at this frank revelation. Yes, he did. He very discreetly took me to one side, I'll have you know, when my mother's back was turned. For let's just say if my mother knew he was discouraging me not to marry Esmeralda, she'd have had his guts for garters. What did your father say? Asked Robin, raising a brow. Well, he told me that Esmeralda was indeed very beautiful. He could understand why my mother was so enchanted by her, and why I was attracted to the woman, enamoured and seemingly bowled over by her. A woman I barely knew. He said to me that I needed more time to get to know Esmeralda, because she might not be as sweet as she first appeared. He told me some women looked sweet on the outside, but were as bitter as gall on the inside. Your father actually said that to you? Asked Robin, looking incredibly impressed. Do you think he might have had an inkling that something was seriously off about Esmeralda? I think so, Paul admitted. I think my father was an astute man, you see. He picked up things about people quickly, read their body language very easily. He was much more perceptive than my mother was. I remember once my mother had a couple over to dinner, you know. My dad said the couple hated each other's guts. My mother told him he was talking absolute nonsense, but a month later that couple got divorced. It turned out they really did despise each other. So your father was astute. Why didn't you listen to his salient advice? Asked Robin, getting more and more drawn into Paul's rather extraordinary love story. Well, if you can call it that. A perfect mismatch might have been a better description. Because I'm an idiot, that's why. And undoubtedly, my mother's persuasiveness was eating me up. She was going on and on in her usual way about how I would never meet anyone like Esmeralda again, and how I would be an absolute fool not to snap her up at once. I guess I believed her. More fool me. Growing up, my mother was a pretty poor judge of character, so why I listened to her, God only knows. I should have paid closer attention to my father's salient words, for I wouldn't be in the sticky mess now, would I? Rather like a bee that's swimming around in the jam and can't fly away. That's me. The sorry story of my life. So did Esmeralda accept your marriage proposal after 2 weeks of dating? Asked Robin. I've got a funny feeling you're going to say yes. I very much doubt my wife would have said yes to a proposal of marriage on our second date. I think I'd have come off as being desperately insecure. I mean, rushing into marriage is insane, any way you look at it. Well, you want to know the answer to the question? Esmeralda said yes right away. On the contrary, she didn't even hesitate. I remember thinking she could do so much better than me. She could have men with lots of money, because beautiful women like her can pretty much snap their fingers and have their pick of the crop. Esmeralda was so lovely, but she happily accepted my proposal without a moment's hesitation. I learnt later that over the years, Esmeralda had dated a significant amount of men, but the relationships had always gone pear-shaped when the men realized what she was really like. So those men were a hell of a lot more astute than I obviously was. Maybe thanks to so many rejections by men in the past, Esmeralda quickly accepted my proposal of marriage. So I was the one that didn't get away, you could say. I remember Esmeralda's parents were both estranged. That should have been another red flag to me. Her mother did not speak to her father anymore. There was no love lost between the two of them. They hated each other's guts, but both were in attendance at the wedding, sitting on opposite ends of the aisle, not even daring to look at each other. The hatred between them was quite palpable. Esmeralda's father came up to me at one point, before the ceremony. He whispered in my ear, "Don't do it, son. My daughter is just like my ex-wife. They are two birds of a feather, rotten to the core, as poisonous as an apple seed. Do yourself a favour. Don't go through with this wedding. You will live to regret it, for the rest of your life, I'm sure. Esmeralda is not what she first appears or what she seems. She's pretending to be sweetness and light. That's a ruse, to draw you in, you see. That's what her mother did to me, and that's what she's doing to you. The best thing I ever did was parting ways with that obnoxious mother of hers, who makes a snake's vipers seem benign. And I hate to tell you this, but my daughter is not far behind. He said that to you? Asked Robin, sounding somewhat aghast. Didn't you ask what the hell he meant? Let me tell you, if my wife's father had come up to me before our wedding ceremony and said stuff like that to me, it would have given me pause for thought, let me tell you. No, I'm afraid I didn't take much notice of what he was saying. I thought the man was embittered, like couples so often are after a stinky divorce. So I naively, very ignorantly paid his advice no heed, and went through with the wedding. You know when you're young you think you know it all, don't you? You arrogantly, ignorantly assume you figured it all out, and one day you realize the cold, hard truth. You realize how naively dumb and inexperienced you actually were, and how little you actually knew. Even though I'm significantly older now than I was back then, I never assumed to know it all. I realize I'm always learning, and that even now I don't know nearly enough about anything. So when did things fall apart between you and Esmeralda? Robin asked. How soon after you got married? Within 2 weeks of marriage. I was finding my beautiful wife insufferable, and wondering what the hell I'd got myself into. For the sweet, demure young woman I thought I married became a complete bully. It was funny when she treated me with such a patronizing, condescending manner. I'd look at her and wonder how I ever could have believed she was beautiful, for she had become like an ice queen, hard, cold, and toffee-nosed in every regard. 3 weeks into our marriage, I was no longer attracted to my wife. Her flawless beauty became defiled and polluted by her ugly personality. Of course, I confided in my mother because we were very close about my feelings. I told her I wanted out of my marriage, and she told me in no uncertain terms that I had made a vow before God, and I could not backtrack on those promises. Of course, she felt desperately sorry for my plight when she realized I'd married a complete dud. But what could she do about it? It was too late to cry over spilt milk. I went to see my pastor on her advice, and he said much the same to me. He told me that I had to make the most of a very bad situation. I had made my resolute promises of faithfulness before God, to honour my wife in both sickness and health, until death us do part. I needed to keep those promises. Esmeralda's mother was as bad as Esmeralda, let me tell you. And when she was alive, she was viciously always putting me down, attacking my character, as furiously and as contemptuously as Esmeralda clearly did. I think she hated all men. So I'm not surprised, quite frankly, that her ex-husband left her and demanded a divorce. I guess I haven't had the courage to do the same. Esmeralda's got quite the ego on her, you see. She's always had a superior attitude, believing that she's better than anybody else. I think she'd come after me with a pitchfork if I dared end our marriage, because she couldn't stand the humiliation of being rejected and all her friends knowing about it. Esmeralda likes to call the shots. By all accounts, image and reputation are everything to her. But I've wanted out of this marriage for years. But if I left her, let's just say, hell hath no fury than a woman scorned. Quite frankly, I haven't got the guts, nor do I have the stamina, to get out of this rather prickly, grisly situation, you could say. I still, beyond all that, take my marriage vows reasonably seriously. Although, if the truth be told, I have never loved Esmeralda, nor do I like her very much. Indeed, I'm living with someone I actually despise. Well, I can't say I'm surprised by that, said Robin. Don't put yourself down. You're a man, not a mouse, Paul. If you want to know the God's honest truth, I'm intimidated by your wife myself, and I'm not even married to her. So God knows what you go through every day. I don't think I could be married to your wife for a single minute, and yet you've put up with her for over 50 years. That makes you a saint in my book. I don't for the life of me know how you've done it, man, but I'm impressed. Poor man, said Keegan, interrupting my grandmother. The woman sounds like a crocodile, but Paul's story has taught me one thing, and that's not to be fooled by a pretty face. Esmeralda was a crocodile, all right, agreed my grandmother. Needless to say, Paul Mitchin was a religious man who took his marriage vows seriously. So a divorce, especially after the pastor's stern advice, was something that he never wanted to go through with. It wasn't on the cards for him, I suspect. He confessed to being desperately unhappy in his relationship with Esmeralda. Isn't that right, William, love? Absolutely. Everything you've said, love, is spot on, said my grandfather. I'm glad you've told our grandchildren the background story of Paul Mitchin's life, for it's relevant to this story. And I think that Paul Mitchin was putting up with a great deal of abuse from Esmeralda. I don't think we knew the half of it. I guess he suffered in silence, like so many men do. I know he claimed that she locked him up in his bedroom and study from time to time, if she was mad at him. They did sleep in separate bedrooms, as Esmeralda couldn't put up with his snoring. She said Paul sounded like a pot-bellied pig. If the truth be told, I think a lot more was going on in the Mitchin household than Paul ever admitted to. Stuff he didn't want to share. What do you mean by that? Keegan asked. I mean, said my grandfather, that I think from time to time Paul Mitchin was physically abused by his wife, more than he ever let us know about, because it was humiliating for him. But at a later stage he did confess to us that the abuse he had been subjected to had indeed also been physical of nature. Keegan pulled a face. You know what, Grandpa? I think men have pride. The last thing they want to do is to admit that the wife is beating up on them. That can be super humiliating for them, don't you think? And more often than not, nobody believes the abuse is taking place, because nobody wants to believe a woman would physically attack her own husband. But I believe it happens. Very well put, Keegan, said my grandfather. Anyway, now that I've told you about Paul Mitchin's marriage, which I believe is a significant part of this story, I'll go back to the day when me and your grandmother were in a bird hide together, with the rest of the magpies, waiting to see if any interesting bird life would come into our focus. And this is where the story leads, to me and your grandmother making quite the decision, which, let's just say, led us into a wild adventure, one that we would never ever forget. Go on, Gramps. I'm eager to hear this story of yours. I've got a feeling it's going to be really good, said Keegan, his face breaking out into a satisfied grin. Very well, said my grandfather, his grey eyes suddenly fixing on me. Perhaps he could sense that he had my undivided attention. Me and my brothers did not so much as flinch, as my grandfather began to talk. Indeed, the living room went so incredibly quiet, as my grandfather drew back the curtains on a story that I had no idea I would find completely riveting, for at this point I had no idea what kind of journey this tale would take us on. Well, said my grandfather again, at the time I was sitting on one of those long wooden benches, inside a bird hide, where all the magpies were gathered. We were all watching out for birds, because that's what you do in a bird hide. But I was sitting quite close to Robin Cartridge and Paul Mitchin, and I managed to overhear a conversation with them. Robin Cartridge was confiding in Paul Mitchin. He was talking about a magnificent cabin, situated on a substantial acreage of land close to Banff, where there was plenty of bird hides on the property, built by the owner of the cabin, a very affluent man called Bridge Conaway, who also lived in Toronto, but would occasionally on the weekends go to his cabin retreat with his wife and family, where he would thoroughly enjoy spending his spare time watching birds. It was obvious from the way that Robin was talking about Bridge Conaway that Bridge was a man very passionate about bird watching, much like your grandmother and I, especially given he had so many bird hides built on his property around the lake area. I'm not exactly sure what Robin Cartridge's relationship was with the likes of Bridge Conaway, as he'd never so much mentioned the man in passing before to any of us magpies, who tended to know most of the passionate bird enthusiasts in Canada at the time. Anyway, my ears were flapping as I eavesdropped on their conversation. Robin Cartwright was telling Paul Mitchin that Bridge Conaway had told him that he and his family were welcome to stay at the cabin that weekend, as the Conaways themselves would be out of state, visiting relatives. Robin Cartwright accepted Bridge Conaway's offer immediately, with an eager enthusiasm, but then he suddenly remembered his wife's sister was turning 70, and they were planning to celebrate her birthday over the weekend at some special venue in Toronto. So he had to tell Bridge Conaway that although he couldn't accept his kind offer, he did have a friend called Paul Mitchin, who just might like to accept the invite on his behalf. Bridge Conaway said that if Paul was a good friend of Cartwright's, well, then he was a good friend of his as well, and that the man was more than welcome to use the cabin that weekend. Robin Cartwright was informing Paul Mitchin about the location and address of this elusive cabin in a sequestered part of Banff, and by the way he was describing the place, as I was listening, I felt rather like a dog drooling over my owner's T-bone steak, and looking for the first opportunity to steal it and gobble it up in a secret corner, without my owner knowing about my duplicity. I felt exactly like that. "You should go, Paul," said Robin Cartridge, encouraging him. "You might be able to get some quality time away from that obnoxious wife of yours. You could well do with a break. You deserve one. Maybe Esmeralda won't mind getting rid of you for an entire weekend. Maybe she'd welcome it. She won't have to throw a complete wobbly about your so-called bad table manners she's always accusing you of," he teased. "I understand the key to the cabin is under the front doormat. There is plenty of food and storage there that you are welcome to help yourself to. Bridge Conaway says you can help yourself to anything you like, including wine from that large cellar of his. It's an exquisite retreat, and the bird life on the property is absolutely incredible, owing, of course, to the large expanse of lake on the property that seems to go on forever. I'd very much like to accept your kind offer," said Paul Mitchin. "It's exceedingly tempting, but I don't think I'll be able to go, very sadly. You know what Esmeralda's like. You've seen her yourself. She claims she's got plans for this weekend, although what they are I couldn't tell you. She always tends to be very, very secretive about that kind of thing." "Well, if you change your mind," said Robin, "the place is accessible to you, and you're welcome to use it. I do encourage you to go. I think it will do you the world of good, and you certainly will not be disappointed. The bird life, as I was saying, is out of this world. Maybe if the worst comes to the worst, you can get Esmeralda to go with you. I know she's like a noose around your neck, but maybe a place like this gorgeous cabin in Banff might bring the best out of her personality." "You wish," chuckled Paul Mitchin, raising a cynical brow. "I don't think anything could put a smile on Esmeralda's face, unless, of course, it meant locking me away in one of the bedrooms at the cabin. Then I suspect that would make her very happy indeed." My brother Keegan stifled a laugh. "I've got a good idea what you're going to say next, Grandpa. You were young at the time, weren't you? You didn't have a lot of money. You realized that Paul Mitchin was unlikely to be going to the cabin near Banff for a weekend retreat, due to his wife Esmeralda. So you decided that you would seize the opportunity for yourself. You'd take Granny with you. Am I right, or am I right? I think I've got you figured out, Gramps, because if I was passionate about birds like you and Granny so obviously are, well, that's exactly what I would do." "Goodness gracious me, Keegan," said my grandmother with a giggle. "There's no pulling the wool over your eyes, is there? You're as sharp as a tack. You're right. Me and your grandfather were absolutely broke at the time. We didn't have much money, although your grandfather took on odd jobs from his father to make some extra money. But the extra money he made was never enough, you know. Your grandfather came to me and told me about the conversation he had overheard between Robin Cartridge and Paul Mitchin. At the time I'd been on the far side of the bird hide, getting very excited about a bird that I'd seen perching on an overhanging branch. I hadn't been privy to overhearing the conversation that Robin Cartridge had had with Paul Mitchin. Your grandfather was very excited about it all. He told me there was no way under any circumstances that he believed Paul Mitchin would go to the cabin that was close to Banff. He was completely under his wife's indomitable unyielding thumb. The cabin was in an exquisite area with a plethora of bird life, and he thought we should go, because we'd never get another opportunity like this again. "How did you feel about that, Granny?" asked Keegan a little cheekily. "I can't imagine you were terribly happy about staying in a stranger's cabin as an uninvited guest for the weekend. You've always liked doing things by the book, Granny." My grandmother chuckled and began to play awkwardly with her pearls. "Well, it was rather naughty. I know it was. And we shouldn't have taken advantage of staying in a cabin that did not belong to us. But when your grandfather talked about the bird life we would ultimately see there, then I'm afraid my resistance wore terribly thin. I mean, we could stay at the cabin for free over the weekend. We'd have the place all to ourselves. Well, it seemed like an idyllic, romantic opportunity for me and your grandfather to be together. We couldn't miss this opportunity. And we were sure that Mr. Bridge Conway expected that Paul Mitchin would be using the cabin for that weekend. He wouldn't realize that a couple of youngsters had indirectly accepted an invite that had not been extended to them. In truth, I doubt if he'd actually known what was going on, that he'd have been that upset. I'm sure if he was penniless as a teenager and loved bird life and was presented with a similar opportunity, that he'd have grabbed it with both hands, like we did. He wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, I'm most sure. I mean, the bird life in that part of the world is nothing short of sensational." "So in other words," said Keegan, "you didn't put up any resistance at all? Shame on you, Granny," he teased mercilessly. "You were encouraging our grandfather to do a very naughty thing. The two of you were as bad as each other." "Well, you get up to mischief when you're young. We were teenagers. I was 18. Your grandfather was almost 20. "We were young, weren't we, William?" said my grandmother, her pale eyes looking at my grandfather adoringly. "It was 1962, I believe it was, if I remember right. Even though it happened so long ago, it does feel like it only happened yesterday. Doesn't time fly? I think it's a stark reminder that me and your grandfather aren't getting any younger. But at the time, Keegan, it may be hard to believe, but we were round and about your age. We were both so passionate about birds. So I guess if the truth be told, we didn't allow ourselves to feel too bad that we were seizing this opportunity to stay at a special cabin. I mean, what could be better than that? It was incredibly fortunate that your grandfather had such a good photographic memory. Still does with his advancing years, you know. So he remembered the address very well. But my goodness, even with a map in hand and a compass, we struggled to find the location of this mystery cabin. The elusive area was heavily wooded, with a labyrinth of dirt roads, you see. It didn't help at all that everything was so badly marked. The dirt roads were in a sad old sorry state, covered in potholes everywhere, filled with muddy sludge, and water because of the recent rainfall. There had been lots of rain in the area, so that didn't help. Needless to say, your grandfather borrowed his father's red Ford Fairlane, I believe it was. We travelled down some of those very precarious roads in that Ford, and it became unstuck so many times, getting caught in the mud with its back wheels and refusing to move forwards or backwards. But luckily, thanks to your grandfather's ingenuity, he managed to get us out of some of those tight scrapes. By the time we managed to find the cabin and navigate our way rather cautiously around some of those dreadful potholes, the poor Ford looked as if it had taken a leisurely roll in a mud bath, like a contented pot-belly pig. I persuaded your grandfather we needed to hide the red Ford further away from the cabin, from prying eyes, by covering it with leafy green foliage, so that no one would know anyone was staying at the cabin. It was just a precautionary measure, I thought. I guess I appreciated the fact that we were intruders, taking advantage of an invitation extended to Paul Mitchin, but not to us. In hindsight, maybe we should have asked Robin Cartwright outright if we could take advantage of the cabin's facilities, as we were both members of the Magpie group. But it never occurred to us to do that. We knew Paul Mitchin wouldn't accept the invitation to stay at the cabin, as he was completely under Esmeralda's indomitable thumb, as we were saying earlier, which was why we'd stolen this opportunity for ourselves. And why not? It had been frustrating to look for the cabin. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, I have to tell you. But we were relieved when we saw the sign which read Lakeview Retreat, and lo and behold, we followed that tiny little road through a maze of tall, lofty trees. The road twisted and turned through the trees like a snake, and then broadened out into a flowery meadow, with mountain views overlooking the most enormous, all-expansive silvery lake, heavily stocked with fish, I believe it was. It glistened so magnificently in the morning sun, and stretched out over an extensive wide area, where there'd been many bird hides erected over the water's edge on stilts, that were just so perfect for bird-watching adventures. Well, me and your grandfather thought we had arrived in heaven. We'd never been to a place quite like this before. It was postcard perfect in every sense of the word, breathtakingly beautiful, wasn't it, William? It sure was, my grandfather agreed. But goodness gracious, what a laborious struggle it was to navigate our way around those dreadful potholes. So many of them, puddles everywhere, rocks, stones, you name it. So it was terrible trying to get to that cabin. The drive was an absolute nightmare in every sense of the word. And let's just say the cabin was so tucked away. If we hadn't seen the sign, we might never have found the place. I begged my father to lend me his red Ford. He'd been reluctant to do so, let me tell you. But finally, after much persuasion, he had agreed to lend it to me. I dreaded seeing how he would react if he observed the state of his red Ford now, especially if I returned it to him in this state after our trip. He wouldn't be remotely happy with me, let me tell you. Let's just say my father was a fastidious man in every sense of the word, and he kept that red Ford of his as shiny as a brand new pin. Anyway, once we found the cabin, I realized the hell we had been through to find this place had been very much worth our while, although I seriously doubted my father would ever agree to lend me his car again, and it turns out he never did. The first thing your grandmother said to me was that the cabin was like something out of a whimsical fairy tale. I guess I was expecting to find a rather run-down old miner's shack, but this cabin was nothing of the kind. It was incredibly stylish, and rather reminded me of a stunning Swiss chalet that rich people hire out for those exclusive skiing holidays in the Swiss Alps. It was luxurious in every single sense of the word, and had every modern convenience you could think about, with high balconies overlooking idyllic views of the silvery lake. Let's just say, if me and your mother had had to pay for a place like this for a weekend, it would have broken the bank, and in those days I certainly didn't have money. I was to learn later that Ridge Conaway was indeed a very wealthy man, who loved and adored birds, so he designed the cabin specifically for that, and there were bird hides strategically situated around the lake for his own personal enjoyment. I would have done much the same, had I been privy to having that kind of money. We knew straight away when we entered the cabin that the owner loved birds as much as we did. There were framed pictures of birds done in detailed watercolours all over the walls. The only word I can use to describe the cabin was it was absolutely stunning. Never seen anything like it in my life, I hasten to say. Your grandmother had brought her pet parrot Kiki along for the journey, and we let Kiki fly around the lake and around the cabin. Goodness gracious me, that parrot had the time of his life. I think he didn't want to leave. It sounds like you hit pay dirt, Grandpa, Keegan teased. I mean, staying at such a fabulous cabin like that, without having to part with a penny of your own cash, when you were both as poor as church mice. Well, that had to be pretty cool. But I can't believe you brought the parrot along with you. Well, that parrot went with your grandmother everywhere she went. When I married your grandmother, I was also committing to that parrot. But thank God Kiki liked me. But was always extremely possessive towards your grandmother, let me tell you. You know what, Gramps, said Keegan. I doubt the owner, what was his name again? Oh, you mean Bridge Conaway. That's right. Well, I doubt he would have really minded that you and Granny were staying at his cabin, because he was equally as fixated on birds as the both of you were. So you shared a lot in common, didn't you? You were birds of a feather, you could say. Well, you could say that, but it didn't make what we were doing right. The truth was I was convicted with a very sizable guilt when we arrived at the cabin, because I was very well aware that me and your grandmother were interlopers, intruding on private property that was not ours. Even as you say, we might have had a lot in common with the owners, as we shared a joint love of birds. What we were doing was wrong. If the cabin had been a bit run down, I guess I would have reasoned to myself that we weren't doing any harm. But the cabin was grandiose, so sumptuously appointed, and it made me feel conscious that what we were doing was more than a little naughty. Let's just say if my father had known what me and your grandmother were getting up to on that weekend, and that we were literally squatting in somebody else's property, he would have been less than amused, and he'd likely think he hadn't raised me right. I remember looking at your grandmother as we got to the front door of the cabin, and I actually thought twice about it. I said to her, "Shall we really do this?" Your grandmother chuckled and said, "Well, we've come all this way now, haven't we? I don't know about you, but I'm physically absolutely exhausted after navigating those horrendous dirt roads. And I'm too tired to care any more about morals, whether what we're doing is right or wrong. All I can say is thank God your dad doesn't know about any of this, because your life would not be worth living." I will admit that I felt so worn out, so jaded, much like your grandmother. So I decided to hell with it. We're going to do this. We're going to stay at the cabin. The owner is away, and yes, the place is much more luxurious than we'd envisaged, but we were going to enjoy ourselves regardless. I reasoned with myself that this would be an intrepid adventure on our parts, that we would look back on with a keen fondness and a plethora of naughty giggles. We searched for the key, and were horrified to discover it was not under the front door mat, as Robin Cartridge had informed Paul Mitchin where it would be found. Luckily, your grandmother found it under a terracotta pot, close to the front door. We put the key in the lock, and the door swung open so smoothly. It was extremely well oiled. The attention to detail in that cabin was utterly extraordinary. Your grandmother, being the perennial romantic, insisted I carried her over the threshold, which I did. I put her down in the entrance hall, and we both stood there and gawked at the lavish furnishings. The place had been clearly kitted out by a very slick designer, who had thought of everything. The place was warm and inviting, with high ceilings and large, cheerful open fireplaces. There were big baskets filled to the brim with firewood, that were begging to be used on a cold evening. I promise you the cabin was luxuriously decorated in every sense of the word. No expense had been spared. There wasn't a speck of dust over anything. I think the place was regularly cleaned, possibly by a local in town. Me and your grandmother were not married, but in that quintessential moment it felt as if we were. I felt as if I was taking my beautiful bride to this very special place to celebrate our union. Soon we were exploring every nook and cranny of the cabin, and our initial guilt about squatting in the place as uninvited guests quickly subsided. We began to thoroughly enjoy ourselves and take advantage of all the facilities on offer, of which there were many, let me tell you. "William, tell them about all the food in the cabin," my grandmother urged him, her eyes bright and shiny. I'd never seen anything like it, let me tell you. Oh, the food in the cabin. Well, it was incredible, said my grandfather. It looked like the select produce you would leave for royalty. The larder was a miniature room filled with a plethora of shelves, and on those shelves were so many canned delicious goods that looked like a home cook had prepared them all. It was something you'd expect to see in a very well-ordered Amish homestead. There were so many delicious stockpiles of food in that cabin, let me tell you, that if Armageddon had struck, well, you wouldn't have had any problems at all. You could have lived off that food for a couple of years with no problem at all. So I'm afraid to say your grandmother and I helped ourselves rather generously to the food. And we also drank some of the swine that we found in the cellar. And it was expensive stuff, let me tell you. Unlike the cheap plonk we were well used to buying that our parents didn't even know we drank. Every morning, me and your grandmother would get up very early, before the sun even rose, and then we'd go off to one of those bird hides, around various spots of the lake, and with our binoculars, we'd make ourselves comfortable, and we'd start to watch the bird life. And did you see anything? My brother Keegan asked. Spot any interesting bird life, perhaps? You bet, said my grandfather. The variety in that part of the world, especially over a vast body of water like that, is breathtaking to say the very least. We did get to see some rare birds and other indigenous wildlife that came to the lake to enjoy a drink. We saw elk, white-tailed deer, moose, mule deer, wolverines, black bears, and even a grizzly on our stay there. So it was absolutely brilliant. We didn't expect to see so many things. It was on Sunday morning that we were hiding out in a bird hide that was not far away from the cabin. That was when we saw a car driving up to the lake, and we were absolutely shocked. We didn't expect anyone would come to the property, as we understood that the owners, the Conways, were away. Well, that was what Robin Cartwright had clearly made known to Paul Mitchin. We were a little affrighted and perturbed at the same time, that we could potentially be caught trespassing on private property that didn't belong to us. I wondered why the car was parking so close to the far side of the lake. I was focusing my binoculars on the lake, and the ugly mustard-coloured Ford Mustang was now parked on the pebbly beach on the furthest side, next to the fishing pier, and I could not help but think that the car looked strangely familiar, and that I'd seen it before, but I couldn't quite place it. With trembling hands your grandmother looked at me, with wide, innocent eyes that were dappled with a grave concern.
Who the hell is that? Who is in that car? What are they doing here, William? I thought you said no one was coming to the cabin, the Conways' cabin this weekend. You said the Conways were away. That's why I agreed to come here with you, William, because the cabin was supposed to be empty. But now someone is here, and I don't even know who they are. But think about it. Our stuff is back at the cabin, in the main bedroom there. Our backpack of clothes. Maybe this person who owns the Mustang comes regularly to the fishing pier to enjoy a spot of fishing, and is going to go back to the cabin and find all our stuff there. Oh, what are we going to do, William? I knew we shouldn't have come here. Why did I listen to you? I knew we were tempting fate. For all we know, the owner could have had a change of plan and decided to come back to the cabin after all. I can't believe this has happened. Thank God we hid our car further away from the cabin so we can escape without being seen. As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind abandoning our backpack and all our clothes. I certainly don't want to cross path with the owner and admit that we've been taking advantage of his hospitality.
Keep your hair on, will you, love? I said to your grandmother. It may not come to that. You heard what Robin Cartwright said to Paul Mitchin. Well, at least I heard. And I very clearly heard him state that the owner, Bridge Conway, was definitely going away, that he'd be out of state. Think about it. This lake is very well stocked with lots of fish. My guess is that the Conways know quite a few folk living in the Banff area. So perhaps some of these people are invited to come fishing here. It would make sense to me. Or maybe this person, who is driving the Mustang, is actually trespassing like we are, and taking advantage of a fishing opportunity, while they believe the Conways are away.
But what if the owners didn't go away after all? Perhaps they had a change of plan and decided to come back to the cabin after all. Didn't Robin Cartwright say the owner of the cabin was a huge bird lover? So he probably comes back here at every given opportunity to pursue his passion for birds. That's why he built all these bird hides all over the place.
Emma, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. There's no way that the person driving the Mustang is Bridge Conway, or any of his family for that matter. For a start, I suspect they would be driving a much more fancy car. They're not short of a bob or two, are they? But whoever is in the Mustang, if they are connected to the cabin in any way, well, we're going to have to leave here forthwith, aren't we? As discreetly as we can, making sure we're not seen, and return to our car. Like you say, we'll abandon our clothes. We didn't bring much anyway, so it's not a train smash, is it? No one need ever know we were even here.
But what about my book of birds my dad gave me? I left it on the table in the hallway.
Well, if the worst comes to the worst, I'll just buy you another one. At this point, I don't mind admitting to you that my confidence was somewhat wavering. The mustard-coloured Mustang was certainly a blight to the beautiful scenery, as far as me and your grandmother were concerned, because we thought we had this place strictly to ourselves, and now there was an intruder on the premises. I was sure the man seated in the Mustang had come here with his fishing gear, and would soon begin to fish, which was why he'd parked his car very close to the fishing pier. In my mind's eye, I was certain me and your grandmother would shortly see this man pulling out a camping chair, along with fishing rods and an icebox containing some ice-cold beers, and then he'd start to fish. For a long while nothing happened. The car remained very still, almost as if the driver was not in a hurry to get out to begin fishing, and my burning curiosity as to the identity of this mystery person was beginning to kill me. Finally, at long last, the driver's side door opened. Me and your grandmother witnessed a blurry silhouette scrambling rather awkwardly out of the car and making his way to the trunk. Your grandmother was the first to let out a gasp. I asked her what on earth was wrong. She sounded incredibly shocked. I could hear that there was horror in her voice.
"Look,
William," she cried out.
"The man is pulling out a rolled-up carpet out of his trunk. You've got to be kidding me. This can't be happening. Oh, my God. There's a dead body in that carpet. I'm telling you, there's a dead body in that carpet. I'm absolutely sure of it. Something nefariously sinister is going on, William, I'm telling you. Oh, William! Oh, my goodness, it's a body. It really is a body. An arm has just dropped out of the carpet. And I'm not kidding either. Is this really happening, William? Please tell me I'm dreaming. I've got to be dreaming."
I focused my binoculars to where your grandmother was pointing. The man was holding a carpet in his arms, and sure enough, a white woman's arm dangled from the carpet. It was like something out of a horror movie, to say the very least. And let me tell you, my heart was drumming so loudly in my chest. I realized that we might be witnessing a murderer disposing of a body, and what better place than a large lake, where it would be eaten up by the fish and never seen again. The man was bending over the ground as he dragged the carpet over the wooden boards of the fishing pier. I could see he was struggling a little, as if the body was a little heavy. But when he got to the edge of the pier, overlooking the water, he began to unroll the carpet, and that was when me and your grandmother saw the body, that looked like that of a woman, lying on the carpet. She was obviously dead. I remember focusing on the woman's body. Her eyes were like marbles, staring vacantly into space. There was no doubt to my mind. She was definitely deceased. You should have seen your grandmother's face, boys. It was a picture, let me tell you. Her eyes were as round as saucers, and her jaw dropped wide open. As much like myself, she was struggling to believe we were witness to this strange event. I think the man, whoever he was, knew that nobody else was around on the property, so he could easily dispose of this body without being seen. I think he must have been very well aware that Bridge Conway and his family were not on the premises that weekend, but little did he realize that he was being witnessed by two people. We could see the man staring down at the body for a long while. He ran his hand through his hair and looked like he was deep in thought. His movements suggested he was nursing a deep regret. We watched in horror as the man got to work in weighting the body down by tying bricks to the ankles, and then he picked up the woman's deceased corpse from the carpet and tossed it over the edge of the fishing pier, so that the body sank to the bottom of the water like a heavy stone. For a brief second he stared down into the water, and then he looked to the left and right, and then straight in the line of our focus. Maybe he sensed he was being watched, I'm not sure. It was in that quintessential moment that me and your grandmother both gasped in unison together, for we couldn't believe what we had just witnessed. It was both thrilling and terrifying at the very same time.
"Oh, goodness, William! I can't believe it! Oh, my goodness! It's Paul Mitchin!"
your grandmother cried out.
"He's only gone and thrown a deceased corpse into the lake. I think it's his wife, William. Oh, my God! He's always talking about how much he can't stand her, how he hates her. Oh, my goodness, William! He's murdered her! I can't believe we're witnessing all this. I think he came here to the cabin to dispose of the body. He thought nobody would be around and about, after Robin Cartwright told him he could have the place for the weekend all to himself. So he knew he could get away with murdering his wife. But we've seen him do it, William. Maybe he decided to murder his wife because he couldn't stand the sight of her any longer. He couldn't bear her constant nagging. It finally made him snap. Domestic abuse is very real, very much alive. And it can lead to murder, you know, when things get out of hand. I hear about it all the time on the radio."
Both me and your grandmother stared at each other in disbelief and confoundment, wondering what on earth we should do. We had witnessed Paul Mitchin offloading what we assumed was his deceased wife Esmeralda into the lake. We knew too well that there was no love lost between him and his wife Esmeralda. But why on earth had he not divorced the woman? Why would he resort to killing her? It made no sense to me. We watched Paul Mitchin rolling up the carpet he'd brought his wife along in, and replacing it back in the trunk of his mustard-coloured Mustang. Me and your grandmother knew, of course, that by informing the police as to what we had both witnessed, we would be admitting that we'd been illegally trespassing on Bridge Conaway's private property. But could we cover up a murder like this? The truth was, everyone in the Magpie Bird Club genuinely liked Paul Mitchin, as did me and your grandmother. People considered him to be a very good, upstanding man, unfairly caught up in a miserable marriage, where he'd been abused tirelessly by his condescending wife. I mean, of course, everyone felt sorry for him. But could we cover up a murder like this? Everyone in the Magpie Bird Club genuinely loved Paul Mitchin, as did me and your grandmother. I did feel very sorry for him to be trapped in such a miserable marriage. But I personally could not believe a man like him was capable of harming his wife. Yes, he did complain about her occasionally, when he was venting, but he was a gentle spirit by nature, so it seemed incongruous to us that he had done this despicable thing. But then again, sometimes the most innocent among us are capable of dreadful atrocities. I think for a long while me and your grandmother were completely shell-shocked. We didn't say a word to each other for quite a while. We watched Paul Mitchin scurry back to his car. Then he drove away. If we thought the movie we had just watched had come to an abrupt end, we were wrong. Things were going to get significantly more interesting, let me tell you. Your grandmother and me would never have anticipated in a million months of Sundays seeing what we saw that day. Your grandmother broke the silence when we began to fully assimilate the gravity of what we'd both witnessed.
"What are we going to do, William? We've just seen Paul Mitchin dropping his wife's deceased corpse in the lake. But we shouldn't have been here in the first place to witness this. How do we explain our presence here to the police? Because we ourselves have committed a crime in staying here illegally, have we not?"
Before I could answer your grandmother's very relevant question, she suddenly said,
"What is that, William?"
She pointed towards the furthest side of the lake, where we had initially seen Paul Mitchin remove his wife's deceased corpse from his mustard-coloured Mustang and discard it into the lake, where it had hit the bottom, as it had been weighed down by many bricks. Then he'd driven away from the area as fast as he possibly could, down some of those very precarious dirt roads. Now we were seeing two ambiguous black human-shaped silhouettes that were as wide as they seemed tall, covered in thatches of thick dark hair, moving swiftly towards the lake with a purposeful intent, as if whoever they were, they themselves had also been witness to what Paul Mitchin had just done. Me and your grandmother were looking very intently through those binoculars, our hands shaking excitedly. We had no idea what we were witnessing, but we do know now what they were. They were two Bigfoot, a male and a female to be precise. The male was of course significantly larger than the female, as you would expect. He looked like a fearsome, very impressive warrior. There was a scar running down his left cheek, and I noticed two of his fingers on his right hand were no more than stumps, so he must have got himself into a terrible scrape at some point.
My brother Keegan whistled at my grandfather's startling revelations about the Bigfoot he and my grandmother had seen. He was marvelling in the fact that they had been witness to such an extraordinary experience. I will admit my young teenage heart began to thump excitedly in my chest, almost as if hundreds of drums were beating all at the same time. I couldn't imagine how exciting would have been to witness a scene like that, but I was also miffed with my brother Keegan for interrupting the smooth flow of my grandfather's extraordinary conversation that had gripped the three of us, almost into a stunned stupor, you could say. Keegan, as usual, was up to his old tricks, interrupting at every given opportunity. I said nothing about the rude intrusions and whistling on my brother's part, and waited politely with bated breath for my grandfather to continue. When my grandfather talked about the Bigfoot, I couldn't help but notice his hooded, deep-set grey eyes lit up like two bright birthday candles, making him look as if he was 18 years old all over again, and suddenly I could see the young man he had once been, witnessing that paradoxical scene in that bird hide. It was for me the closest I've ever got to taking a trip back in time, all the way to the 1960s, a long time before I was ever born. There was a wistful look on my grandfather's face, as if the nostalgic, indelible memories of that experience had brought him back to life again. I noticed instead of slouching back on his chair, with his shoulders slumped forward, and his expression extremely relaxed, he was now sitting up so straight, he looked as if he'd suddenly grown several inches taller. What my brothers didn't know was that I was nursing a secret of my own. The secret was that I was absolutely fascinated in the subject of Bigfoot, and had been since I was old enough to know about the cryptic creatures. I had longed for an encounter of my own, but never in a million years would I have ever believed for a single moment that my grandparents had seen two live Bigfoot with their own eyes, and they could have potentially gone to their graves without sharing their unorthodox encounter with us. And that would have been a travesty, in my opinion. My grandfather wiped some sweat that had gathered away from his brow with the back of his hand. He asked my grandmother to go and get him a shot of whiskey, as this was a part of the story where he needed some Dutch courage to tell it. I watched him throw the whiskey at the back of his throat, so that it burned his tongue, and then he handed my grandmother the little glass back, and urged her to give him another shot. My grandmother raised a brow, but nevertheless obliged his request, filling his glass with yet more whiskey. The whiskey did the trick, because my grandfather started to visibly relax, almost as if the heat from the alcohol had anaesthetized some of the adrenaline-soaked memories of that event that had turned my grandfather, right before our eyes, back into that 18-year-old boy.
"Go on, love,"
said my grandmother encouragingly, urging my grandfather to continue with the story.
"Tell them what happened next. Can't you see the boys are now on the edge of their seats? They're looking at you with wide, wide eyes. Don't keep them in suspense a moment longer."
"Well," said my grandfather, with a very big sigh,
"I truly couldn't believe what I was witnessing with my eyes, and nor could your grandmother. These two Bigfoots, as I was saying, were male and female. Perhaps they were companions or partners, I don't know. They certainly looked to be that way. They were huge in size, but the male, well, I've never seen anything like him before. He was absolutely massive. I guess close up he could have been 10 foot tall, possibly more. The female, I'd guess, was about 8 foot. They were covered in dense, very thick, dark flowing hair, and were robustly built. I think the thing that amazed me most about the critters was how human they were. Their heads were pyramid-shaped, their necks short, their noses squat and flat against their faces, and their cheekbones very high. They were standing side by side each other on the fishing pier, looking down at the water, and talking excitedly together. The chatter went on for ages, as if they were discussing something at great length, and it was at that point I assumed they had seen Paul Mitchin throwing his wife's corpse into the lake, so they knew exactly what was down there. All of a sudden both Bigfoot jumped into the lake from the fishing pier and disappeared under the water for quite some time. They could hold their breaths, let me tell you. But the male Bigfoot emerged from the water and brought out of the lake the deceased corpse of Paul Mitchin's wife, Esmeralda. This male Bigfoot carried the corpse out of the water, with the bricks dangling from her ankles, and they laid her down on the wooden rafters of the fishing pier. They began to talk to each other in earnest. It seemed like the female Bigfoot seemed to be calling all the shots, telling the male Bigfoot what needed to be done, and he appeared to be nodding in agreement, as if they'd reached a decision of some sort. The male Bigfoot then dived into the water again, and came up to the surface with 2 trout in his hands, which he whacked on the ground very forcefully. I remember thinking, how the hell could this male Bigfoot catch 2 large trout with his bare hands under the water like that? I tried doing that as a boy, you know. The fish would fly past me. Imagine how nimble and quick-fingered you need to be to grab a fish under the water, and a sizable one at that, and prevent it from slipping through your fingers like butter. The 2 Bigfoots sat on the edge of the fishing pier, their legs dangling into the water. They were extremely relaxed and unflustered, as if they had all the time in the world on their hands. They both began to casually eat the trout together, from the head of the fish, and they spat the tail out in the water. I think they even ate the bones, although I can't be sure. Then they rose to their feet, and the male Bigfoot just threw the dead corpse over his shoulders, and both of them just glided away into the woods, and were gone from our sight. "Oh, my God," said Keegan. "You don't think they were going to eat the body of Paul Mitchin's wife, Esmeralda, do you, Gramps?" he asked, his eyes growing rounder by the second. "No, I certainly don't believe that. What I failed to tell you," said my grandfather, "is when the Bigfoots brought her body out of the water, they examined her closely, as if willing for her to still be alive. They treated her corpse with kindness, dignity, and respect, as if she was one of their own. So I would put money on it that they had no intention of eating her. The Bigfoot struck me as having emotional intelligence, which means they would exercise compassion. I'm not sure what they did with Esmeralda's body, but I'd like to think they buried her in a very nice, pretty place. Maybe they didn't want her deceased corpse to contaminate the lake, or maybe they thought it would be good to bury her in a more dignified spot. Let's just say, watching those 2 Bigfoot at work, I was struck by their humanity. They were very gentle with the corpse, and not exactly gentle with the fish they intended to eat. After the Bigfoot had all but gone, me and your grandmother remained in that bird hide for another 30 minutes or so, caught up in the shock of what we'd witnessed. I think we both felt we had been flung into an alternative reality. "Oh, my God, William, did we just witness that? Or am I going completely insane?" "We sure did, love. I hate to burst your bubble, but no, this isn't a dream." "What are we going to do, William?" your grandmother asked me. "Even if we went to the police and admitted to illegally squatting in someone's cabin over a weekend and watching Paul Mitchin dispose of his wife's deceased corpse, her body is now missing. It's been taken. If we tell the police this, and we tell them we witnessed two hairy human-like creatures steal her body, they'll think we're wasting their time and making up nonsensical stories. We'd look as stupid as hell, wouldn't we? I don't know about you, William, but I don't want to humiliate myself. I'm almost relieved, to tell you the truth, those big creatures took her body, because now we can put this all behind us, pretend it never happened. That's what I think we should do. I agreed with your grandmother on this one, so we decided to keep Storm. So you're saying, Gramps, that Paul Mitchell never got into trouble for murdering his wife? Said Keegan, sounding very disappointed. I mean, he did something atrociously evil. I know Esmeralda wasn't a nice person, but even she didn't deserve to die. If he hated her so much, he should have divorced her. That's what a normal man would have done. You make some good points, son, but the story isn't over yet. I haven't even got started. My grandfather continued. As I was telling you, when me and your grandmother joined the Magpies, we had become close. All of us had. We were like one big happy extended family, because we shared a love of birds in common. And as I told you, the generation gap simply did not matter. After Paul Mitchell disposed of his wife's corpse in the lake, even your grandmother was saying that she thought that possibly both Esmeralda and Paul must have had an argument that day. Things had got out of control, and Paul had lost it, and then in a moment of unbridled rage, he had killed his wife. I knew there was more to the story than met the eye, but I wasn't expecting at our very next bird gathering that Paul Mitchell would confess to what he'd done. You mean he simply admitted to murdering his wife? I can't believe that, said Keegan. He went to so much trouble to cover up his crime. He disposed of his wife's body in the lake, and then he candidly admits to what he's done. That's not normal. Well, it's not exactly like that, Keegan, said my grandmother, interjecting. Me and your grandfather went to another bird rendezvous with the rest of the magpies, you see. I can't remember the spot, but I do remember it overlooked a magnificent lake. We were all sitting in a bird hide, overlooking this lake, watching the birds, but I was the one that was examining poor Mitchen's demeanour very, very intently, to see if he was exhibiting any signs of guilt over what he'd recently done to his wife Esmeralda. I noticed he was extremely pale and emaciated. He looked as if he hadn't eaten a hearty meal for many days. In front of the entire bird group, I suddenly burst out and said, "How's your wife, Paul?" And that, I'm afraid, was the straw that broke the camel's back. After I asked that question, Paul just buckled up. He broke down, let me tell you. I'd never seen a man just burst into tears before. So we all naturally gathered around him and asked him what was wrong, although of course me and your grandfather knew exactly why Paul was so obviously distressed. But we wisely said absolutely nothing. I killed Esmeralda. I killed my wife. She's no longer with us, he said. If you want to know where she is, she's buried at the bottom of a lake. You can call the police if you like. Have me arrested for murder. It's no less than what I deserve. What the hell happened? Robin Cartwright asked. You're a good man, Paul. You must have finally snapped, and I can't blame you for that. I'd have probably killed that woman myself if I was married to her, and I'm not even a violent man. That wife of yours was insufferable. Tell us what happened. I'm sure she provoked you to anger, and you just snapped. It happens, but it's not premeditated. At this point, Paul Mitchin pulled up his shirt. Oh, my word, I've never seen anything like it in my entire life. All kinds of old and fresh bruises all over his chest, burnt marks everywhere, from where his wife Esmeralda had stamped out cigarettes on his skin. Can you believe that someone would actually do a thing like that to another person? Well, everyone in the Magpies was very distraught by this. They could see the years of abuse indelibly marked on that poor man's skin. Apparently Esmeralda would regularly take a heavy metal cast iron pan and throttle Paul with it, sometimes so forcefully that he could barely walk the next day. And that woman had broken many of his bones, you know. He always made light of those broken bones to the nurses at the local hospital, because he didn't want to draw attention to the fact that his wife was mistreating him so very badly. I remember feeling incredibly angry that Esmeralda had been abusing him for all those years. If she had been alive, I'd have throttled her myself, let me tell you. "What happened, Paul?" asked Robin kindly, in a very gentle, reassuring voice. "Please tell us. We cannot help you if you don't tell us what happened. And based on how that dreadful woman has been beating you up for all these years, I have no sympathy for Esmeralda's current plight, I'm afraid. At least the abuse has stopped." Paul was physically shaking as he told us his story. His eyes were filled with a great deal of regret, almost as if he blamed himself for what had happened. "Well," he said candidly, "I told Esmeralda that you had told me, Robin, that I was welcome to use Bridge Connor's cabin to do a spot of bird watching. So I told her about it and she blew a gasket. I said I would really enjoy spending a weekend away on my own at the cabin, taking advantage of the bird hides on the property, so I might be able to spot some unusual bird life. Esmeralda was incensed by this. She screamed at me furiously. 'I let you go bird-watching with the magpies against my better judgment. And now look at you. You want to spend a weekend all on your own at Bridge Connor's cabin near Banff so you can watch birds. You're pathetic. You're a grown man, fixated on watching birds. What's wrong with you? I'm sorry, Paul, but you're not going anywhere. You're staying here with me, whether you like it or not.' When my wife Esmeralda told me that, well, normally I'd just shut up, say nothing more about it. In truth, the idea of going bird-watching at Bridget Connor's cabin was very appealing to me. I've heard how good the bird-watching is over at his place. I decided to express my desire to go more passionately, knowing full well, of course, that I was only going to make my wife all the more angry. But for some reason I couldn't help myself. It's just one weekend, Esmeralda. I don't get opportunities like this every day. Please, just this once let me go." At that remark of mine, all hell broke loose in the kitchen. Esmeralda was incensed. She was drinking a glass of wine. She threw it at me, and the red wine spilt over my shirt and onto the kitchen floor, and there was a lot of it, along with shards of broken glass that were standing up like deadly weapons. "Look what you made me do! I've broken that wine glass, and there's wine everywhere on the kitchen floor. I wanted to enjoy this drink, but you made me so mad. How dare you argue with me, Paul? I told you you're not going to go to that cabin in Banff. Why the hell won't you listen to me?" And there she was again, with the cast-iron frying pan in her hand, thrusting it towards me. In that moment I didn't fancy any more bruises on my battered body, so I grabbed her hand to stop her, and managed to extract the cast-iron pan from her. I will admit I'd never done such a bold thing before, but I was very tired of being beaten up by my wife, and for the first time in a long time, I stood up for myself and put up some resistance. I was tired of her telling me what I could and could not do, and treating me like an insubordinate child that needed to be towed into line. My resistance provoked Esmeralda to a level of irrational rage that I have never seen before. Her face was red. She was grinding her teeth. She ran over to the butcher's block and grabbed a sharp knife, which she began waving around precariously in front of me. And then she became manically deranged, and that was when I knew she was going to stab me, because all sense of rationality had flown out of the kitchen window. My wife had become like a rabid wild animal that was foaming at the mouth and was out of control. I'd never seen her so irate before. She lunged towards me with the knife, making a straight aim for my chest. I knew if I didn't defend myself or stop her, that I would be a dead man. I pushed her away from me. The knife went flying into the air, landing on the floor. Esmeralda suddenly fell backwards, slipping on the wine that was on the floor, and falling over a huge glass shard that went straight through her chest. There was blood weeping from that wound, so much of it. I ran over to her, kneeling over her body and trying to wake her up, but she was out cold. And then I felt her pulse, and I realized in that moment she was not breathing. I think she died before she bled out. I tried to, do the best I could for her, give her some CPR, but nothing worked to revive her. She was dead. I think she died from a head wound, rather than from the glass shard, but I can't be sure. I know I should have gone to the police, but I was scared. I was afraid they wouldn't believe my story. They'd think I'd killed my wife. The kitchen looked like a formidable crime scene, let me tell you. Well, when Paul Mitchin told us his story, we unequivocally believed every word of it. And we decided that he needed to put this behind him, and that we should all pretend that none of this had happened. And it worked out fine, you know. No one ever asked Paul any questions about his missing wife, because Esmeralda just didn't have any friends to speak of. So Paul just told anyone who asked that they had separated. No one ever knew that she went missing. We grew very fond of Paul Mitchin over the years, keeping his secret buried between us. He finally did meet a lovely lady, so he lived a happy and long life, until him and his new lady friend died when they reached their late 90s. I never doubted Paul's story for a second. And I will say this, when he began to live a brand new life without Esmeralda, he blossomed so much. It was like he came alive again. Paul Mitchin went to his grave believing Esmeralda's body was at the bottom of that lake. But me and your grandfather knew very differently. We were well aware that 2 Bigfoot had removed her remains, but I'm sure they buried her somewhere nice. Well, I like to think that anyway, even though she didn't deserve to be fussed over, after what she'd done to Paul. "Wow, that's an incredible story," said Keegan, his eyes brightening. "I'm glad you kept Paul Mitchin's secret. His wife was a prize cow. As far as I'm concerned, he didn't murder her at all. The woman was coming at him with a knife. He pushed her away to save himself. She fell backwards on the wine she'd spilt, and the glass she'd broken. If she hadn't been so outraged in the first place with Paul over something so insignificant, none of this would ever have happened. It was an accident." That is what all the magpies believed. We told Paul that. We told him that his wife had brought this upon herself, that it was a dreadful accident, and he was only pushing her away from him when she came at him with that knife. Most of us felt that by the sounds of things, she was manic, that if Paul had not defended himself in the way he'd done, she'd have probably successfully killed him. I think the reassurances from all the magpies helped Paul gain a sense of perspective over everything, and put this dreadful calamity behind him. He was, of course, willing to go to the police and confess to everything, but everyone in the Magpies said they'd take his secret down to the grave with them, and they were true to their words, But now that Paul Mitchin is dead, it doesn't really matter that we are sharing his story now. "The things that happen to people," said Keegan. "The world is alive with the interesting stories of people's lives. And you and Gramps, well, you own this amazing story." "I know," said my grandmother. "It is remarkable, and I'm glad we shared it with you boys. Wait a minute, I've got something to show you. I found this on a recent trip to Banff, It's a flyer about a cabin available for rent. And would you believe it? I was dumbfounded when I saw it. I discovered that this is the cabin that me and your grandfather stayed in. The cabin where we observed the 2 Bigfoot by the lake. The place is being rented out by a man called Keith Conway, so I guess he must be connected to the original owner, Bridge Conway. And he's a grandson, I imagine, or something like that. The place is available to book over the weekends." My grandmother looked up at my grandfather and said, "Come on, William. Let's do it, shall we? Our grandchildren would really appreciate it, "Let's do what?" asked my grandfather, looking a tad perplexed, as if he couldn't get the gist of what my grandmother was trying to say. Well, I was thinking if we hire out the cabin that we stayed in all those years ago for next weekend, or this weekend, actually this weekend would be better, we could take our grandchildren back to where it all happened. Go on, it would be great fun. We can take them fishing and bird watching. How about it?
Oh, that would be amazing! I cried out enthusiastically. I'd love to go to that cabin, Grandpa, where you and Granny saw the Bigfoot. Please, can't we go? My grandfather looked up at me in surprise. He was taken aback by my enthusiastic outburst, which was unusual for me, as by nature I could be quite reticent. Moments later my two brothers were echoing my very sentiments about this potential weekend escape, which would make my grandparents' story come alive for us even more.
You would be keen to go to the cabin?
My grandfather asked me. Very keen, I said. But I guess it might be too expensive, because you yourself said the place was very special, so I don't imagine it's very cheap.
That's not what I'm worried about, said my grandfather. Your grandmother fails to realize that Banff is a very popular tourist destination, and places like the Conaway cabin, well, let's not kid. They're often booked up months, sometimes years in advance. I very much doubt we'd even get a look in, especially at such late notice for this weekend.
My grandmother, who was a perennial optimist by nature, eagerly urged my grandfather to phone Keith Conaway, who owned the cabin that my grandparents had frequented all those years ago.
The booking number is on the leaflet, William, she said, handing it to him. Please give Keith Conaway a call, will you? If he says the place is booked up, fair enough. I can understand that. But there's always a chance it might be available for us. So why don't you give him a call, just for the hell of it? All right, Emma. I'll give him a call for your sake. But I'm begging you not to get your hopes up. A cabin like that would be in high demand in Banff, and I'm pretty certain it shall not be available.
I held my breath, as did both my brothers, as my grandfather put his phone on loudspeaker so we could all listen in to the conversation. All I could think about was that if we could go on this weekend retreat, maybe I might also spot a Bigfoot. Whether my brothers were nursing similar thoughts, I had no idea.
Hello, Keith Conaway speaking. How can I help you? Hello, Mr. Conway. This is William Bennett speaking. I'm just phoning you about your cabin near Banff. I was wondering if it might be available for this weekend. I'm sorry it's late notice, because I would like to book it for me and my grandchildren if I may. I'm very sorry, Mr. Bennett. I'm afraid the cabin is booked up 2 years in advance. We won't be able to oblige your request, I'm afraid. But give me your details anyway, just in case there is a possible cancellation. But I feel I should warn you that very rarely ever happens. So what did I tell you? Did I not warn you? Said my grandfather, after he'd ended the phone call, glancing over at our disappointed faces. But I doubt anybody was more disappointed than I was. It was about an hour later that the phone rang again, and my grandfather answered it. Hello, he said. Hello, is that William Bennett? This is he, speaking, said my grandfather. Oh, hello, Mr. Bennett. This is Keith Conaway speaking. I was talking to you an hour ago on the phone about the cabin near Banff you wish to book for the weekend. Ah, that's right, said my grandfather. What about it?
The phone was still on loudspeaker, so when we heard that Keith Conaway was on the telephone, speaking to my grandfather, me and my brother and my grandmother were surrounding him like an eager pack of coyotes, hoping that there might be something we could put our teeth into. Could there be a change of plan, perhaps, I wondered? Could it be that there might have been a sudden and last-minute cancellation? Please, God, let this be the case. Could I dare to hope, I wondered? I found myself crossing my fingers tightly and looking at my grandfather with wide, almost begging eyes. Well, Mr. Bennett, I do believe I've got some good news for you. I don't know how this has happened, because it never does. But against all the odds, we've had a last-minute cancellation. The people who hired the cabin you want to hire from me have paid for it in full, along with the food supplies and everything else.
but something important appears to have come up for them, so they cannot use the cabin this weekend. They have generously offered it to you. Free of charge, I hasten to say, so everything will be accessible to you. Food and anything else you might need. It's all yours for the weekend if you want it."
I'm not exactly sure what my grandfather said to answer Mr. Conaway, because by then we were all shrieking with delight, for we couldn't believe our good fortune and how our luck had miraculously changed, because not only were we going to stay at that beautiful cabin in Banff, but we were going to stay there with all our expenses paid. And from the leaflet, I knew that that cabin did not come cheap. I do recall that when we arrived at the cabin, which according to my grandfather was like a piece of cake to find, compared to all those years ago, because now everything was clearly marked, and the roads were a lot less laborious than they had been in the 1960s, although in these parts they were still a tumble of dirt roads, and on some of those sequestered roads we passed elk and white-tailed deer that didn't even scamper away as we drove past them. They seemed tame. Then we saw a signpost and a little arrow, which my grandmother pointed to excitedly. "This is it! We go down that tiny road through the trees, and then we'll finally get to the cabin." My grandfather's white SUV rattled precariously as we drove up a dirt road that was fringed by tall, lofty trees on both sides. The road, as my grandmother had informed us, opened up into an alpine field or meadow that was set against the most breathtaking escarpment of mountains that seized the skyline in a pompously self-assured sculptural deportment that demanded your immediate attention, while a seeping mist appeared to cover the top of the mountains, rather reminding me of ocean spray over the rocks. It was all so breathtakingly beautiful, as the mountains cast their resplendent reflections over the large silvery lake, that was so gargantuan in size that it spread out across the landscape like a meandering river that snaked through the trees, many of which were casting their ethereal shadows over the lake, while some of them were bent over the water's edge, like old men with hunched backs. As I climbed out of the car, I could see and hear an abundance of bird life. My attention was then drawn to the cabin, which was exactly as my grandmother had described, only better than I could have ever envisaged. I think the cabin had been well maintained over the years, and significantly modernized, so it was both sophisticated and sumptuously cosy in every regard. Even though the cabin had been a stunner in the 1960s, it didn't appear to date in any way, probably because it was a timeless design, and did look every bit to be like a glamorous Swiss chalet, done in that golden wood, with extensively high balconies that made the most of those spectacular, all-encompassing views. The cabin on the inside most certainly did not disappoint. It was extremely well presented. Everything was luxurious, from the plush furnishings to the bed linen and towels, and of course there was a vast selection of food available for us to enjoy, which was like something you'd get from the finest delicatessens. My grandparents became like two teenagers again, caught up in the bubble of their nostalgia. They held hands together as they went around the place exploring the cabin. Then they walked around the lake, revisiting some of the bird hides. Me and my brothers gave them their space, as we went exploring on our own, and as beautiful as it all was to see the place where my grandparents' story had played out, I was suddenly hit with the realization that it would be extremely unlikely that I'd get to see a Bigfoot over the weekend. I mean, what was I really thinking? Everybody knows that Bigfoots are elusive by nature. Some people doubt they even exist, but I'm not one of those cynical types. My brothers were so excited to be at the cabin, and the weekend was so incredibly magical. We enjoyed amazing views, some fishing, hiking, and a spot of bird watching with my grandparents. But all the while, I couldn't stop thinking about a Bigfoot, how much I'd enjoyed to have an encounter with one. It was as I was retiring in my bedroom in the cabin that I could see my brother Keegan standing there in the doorway. He looked at me soberly.
"Don't be too disappointed, bro," he said to me.
"Disappointed? What do you mean, disappointed?" I asked him.
"You don't have to pretend," said Keegan, his eyes bright with mischief. "I know."
"You know what?" I asked.
"I know you were hoping to see Bigfoot on this holiday, well, on this weekend, because our grandparents saw two Bigfoots years ago. But I hate to break it to you, bro. I don't think it's going to happen again. In fact, I doubt it. Don't they say that lightning never strikes in the same place twice?
I was looking at my brother Keegan. My eyes were on stalks. How could he possibly know how I was feeling on our trip to the cabin, and that I was secretly nursing a fascination for Bigfoot? Keegan began to laugh. He pointed a finger at me. I gotcha. You may be the quiet one of us brothers, but I've known you a long time, bro. I saw how your face lit up like a Christmas tree when Grandpa told us about the 2 Bigfoot he and Granny saw at the lake in 1962. I could sense that you were hoping you would spot a Bigfoot on this trip. I frowned as I tried to avoid Keegan's inquiring gaze. I couldn't believe he knew me so well. He'd figured out exactly what was going on in my mind. All right, I said. I admit I'm disappointed. I was hoping to encounter a Bigfoot, but I had no idea that I was that transparent. I thought I held my feelings in very well.
You do hide your feelings extremely well, bro, said Keegan. Sometimes so well, in fact, that I can't figure out what goes on in that head of yours. You're a deep thinker, I know that. But I knew how you were feeling today, because I was feeling it too.
You were? I asked, looking at my brother with wide eyes. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me, Keegan?
Yes, bro, I am as fascinated about Bigfoot as you are. Don't look so surprised. You have no idea how excited I got when I heard Grandpa's story. I was in absolute shock. And when Grandma suggested we came to the cabin, where this happened for the weekend, my first thought was, what if we get to see a Bigfoot? The truth is, when we arrived here, much like yourself, I was hit with the daunting realization that such an encounter was unlikely to happen for us. So I just wanted you to know, bro, I get how you're feeling, but on the brighter side of things, some things are just not meant to be.
I suppose not, I said. That night I retired to my sumptuously cosy bed, with the Egyptian cotton sheets, feeling secretly glad that Keegan felt as I did. It didn't make me feel so alone. He was such a forthcoming person, who wore his heart on his sleeve. But it would seem he had also been nursing a secret fascination for Bigfoot, like myself, but had never been bold enough to admit it to anyone. Well, not until now, that is. It was good to know that he was sharing in my disappointment, because I knew that we would return to my grandparents' place in Toronto, having thoroughly enjoyed a lovely weekend at the cabin, but not having our wish of a Bigfoot encounter being fulfilled. Still, I guess you can't have everything. I reassured myself that we had been extremely lucky coming here. My grandparents' story had come alive for us when we had been to the fishing pier and seen where Paul Mitchin had disposed of his wife Esmeralda's body, and the area on the lake where the Bigfoots had dived into the water to retrieve her body and catch a couple of fish. It was a cool, very pleasant night. As often in the mountains, the temperatures drop significantly, so it can make you sleep blissfully well. The moment my head hit the pillow, I was out like a light. I probably would have slept like a baby, if I wasn't suddenly being jolted wide awake by a very excited Keegan. I felt annoyed to feel my brother shaking me so vigorously in the middle of the night. I had been thrown back to reality, as if I'd been flung through a windscreen window of my dreams and sustained a whiplash injury. It felt a little like that. I looked up at my brother through sleepy eyes, surprised to see how excited he appeared to be. I'd never known my older brother to look like that, not even on Christmas Day when he gets to open up all his presents. This was a look that seemed to engage a mixture of hope and expectation. "What is it?" I grumbled, unable to hide my extreme annoyance. "It's a Bigfoot, I'm sure of it," said Keegan, his voice almost shaking. He sounded that thrilled. At this I sat up sharply. "A Bigfoot? You saw a Bigfoot? My God! Where? Outside the cabin?" I asked him.
"No, silly," laughed Keegan. "I heard a Bigfoot whooping. That's what I was trying to tell you."
I was now extremely irritated with Keegan. I mean, can you blame me? I had been excited for a brief moment, sharing in his unbridled enthusiasm that a Bigfoot was around. But now there was a catch. He was telling me he'd heard whoops. That didn't mean anything at all as far as I was concerned. A whooping sound could have been anything. It could have come from a bird, a wild animal, not necessarily a Bigfoot. Besides all that, sound can travel over vast distances. So whoever was making the whooping sound, well, it could be anything, couldn't it? And it could be miles away at that. You woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me you heard whoops, Keegan, I said dismissively. It could have been a bird, you realise that? In fact, it probably was. Now go away. I want to get back to sleep.
No, you're not going to sleep, bro. We're going to investigate that whooping sound. There is a distinct possibility it could have come from a Bigfoot. And what if I'm right?
A possibility, I smirked. Not a certainty. There's a big difference. And even if the whooping did come from a Bigfoot, what are the chances we'd even see the critter?
Well, there's certainly not going to be any chances with that attitude of yours. If you want to lie here in a bed pontificating, fair enough. Go ahead. Go back to sleep if you like. But if I come back from my little adventure out of doors to tell you I happened to spot a Bigfoot in the woods, and you missed out on that because you wanted to sleep, don't blame me for your loss.
My brother's words succeeded in ruffling my feathers significantly, and before I knew it I'd risen out of bed and hurried over to the wardrobe to put on some clothes, including a sweater, for I knew it might be chilly out of doors. It was, as expected, a dark night when we left the cabin, swaddled in silence, along with the sounds of my grandparents' contented snores. I'm not sure they'd have been best pleased had they known we were evacuating the cabin in the middle of the night to search for the elusive cryptid creature that I was certain we would not get to see. The idea of Keegan having an encounter from which I was excluded would be too unbearable, which was why in my foolishness I'd agreed to come along with Keegan on this seemingly thankless stroll through the woods at the dead of night. The night was filled with the orchestra of frogs and crickets. There was a profound nip in the air, and there was dew all over the grass. The velvety black sky was bejewelled with dazzling silvery stars and a crescent-shaped pearly moon. Me and my brother crossed the wooden trellis bridge over the lake and walked through the trail between the trees on the other side, and thank God we were well equipped with torches on hand and were wearing good walking boots. It was pitch black among the trees. Nothing had prepared me for how dark it was. Everything felt airy and incredibly spooky. Many of the trees in the dead of night look ambiguously shadowy, like giants with gnarled hands that are eager to reach out and grab you unawares. As we walked gingerly through the trees, the soles of our walking boots crackled, rather like firewood being burnt on the grate. It was the sound caused from the crushing of twigs and fallen leaves beneath our soles. I tried not to entertain, of course, any fears, but it was difficult as it was so aggressively dark in the woods. It was difficult not to feel vulnerable and very conspicuous. It was then we heard the whooping sounds, and in that moment I felt an excitement bubble up inside me, for I knew instinctively that those whooping sounds did not come from a bird, and they were very close. My heart began to thunder in my chest. I looked at my brother earnestly. "You heard that?"
Of course I heard that. Why do you think I woke you up, bro?
"It's got to be a Bigfoot," I said to him. "It's got to be." It was in that moment, in my quivering excitement, I decided to call out to the Bigfoot in my mind. Why I did this, I do not exactly know. I remember saying, "If you're out there and you're real, please show yourself to us. I've come out on this dark night especially to look for you. I'm begging you to show yourself to us. We mean you no harm. We're just curious to know that you're real." Me and my brother heard the whoops again, and we moved down a path which we believe was where the sound was coming from. You're probably wondering why we would want to encounter a Bigfoot, for there are no guarantees that such an encounter would be of a friendly nature. What if the Bigfoot was mean or intended to harm us, or was a threat to our safety? I'm afraid I did not consider the negative implications of such an encounter, as I'd inherited my grandmother's optimism. And if the truth be told, even though I've heard of people's negative encounters with Bigfoot, I really didn't think that I would need to worry about something like that. We continued down the path through the trees, our visibility cruelly obscured by the forest canopy above our heads, that stole away any glimmers of pearly moonlight, but our torches were good enough. Ostensibly, Keegan and I didn't know exactly where we were going, and it didn't even appear to matter to us, for our eagerness projected us ever forward. And then we saw her. She stepped out onto the path, and on her ponderous shoulders she was carrying a small baby. It was a female Bigfoot, very large in size, and Keegan abruptly shone his torch into her face, which she didn't appear to like. But she stood on the path looking at us, and my excitement was like nothing I've ever known before. Every single cell in my entire body stood up to attention as the blood rushed through my veins, prickling my nerve endings with pulses of electricity. Even though my encounter with this female Bigfoot and a baby that looked exactly like her was so fleeting, I took her all in so that I would never forget her as long as I live, and I knew Keegan was doing much the same. I would say she was possibly about 8 foot tall, robustly built, with powerful shoulders and overlong arms. Her body was covered with dark hair, but her human-like face was expressive, and her soulful eyes were dark and deep. Then it happened. A voice entered my head, a voice that was not my own, and it was female. "I heard you call. You wanted me to show myself to you, so here I am. Here I am with my little baby. And yes, I'm real. I must be going now, I'm afraid. My baby needs feeding." And with that, she nodded and glided away. My brother was so shocked by our encounter that the torch he was carrying slipped out of his hand and crashed onto the forest floor. We gawked at each other in amazement. "Bro, we saw a Bigfoot, what did I tell you? Aren't you glad you came with me? What if you were still in bed? You'd have missed out on the most amazing event. Wasn't she beautiful? Wasn't she magnificent? What about the baby she was carrying on her shoulders? Oh, goodness gracious, I've never seen anything so lovely in my whole life. She was real, bro. She was real. We saw her in the flesh. She was standing 3 feet away from us. Oh, and she was so human, so incredibly human. And you could tell she was compassionate by nature. Did you hear her voice? She was speaking to us telepathically. I can't believe we saw a Bigfoot." And those were the words that kept coming out of our mouths. We had seen a Bigfoot, and it was the most wonderful thing we could ever have imagined. We now had a treasured story all of our own that we could add to our grandparents' story, but this was one that we would never forget. Even looking back, I am completely confounded that a single thought I engaged in, that I was having in the woodgrove, was picked up telepathically by a female Bigfoot, who decided, out of sheer kindness, to show herself to me. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.